The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of gray October Tuesday that smells like wet leaves and old regrets. Margaret Hollis was in her kitchen when the envelope came through the mail slot, and she almost didn't pick it up. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. At 73, she had learned that official envelopes rarely carried good news. Bills mostly, or notices from the council about the lane outside her flat needing resurfacing. Or, once, the letter from the hospital that had changed everything 7 years ago when Gerald died and left her with a paid-off car, a small pension, and the strange, hollow work of learning how to exist inside a life built for two. She picked it up because the return address had the name Ashford and Blythe Solicitors printed in embossed letters, and below that, the name of a town she had not allowed herself to think about for years. Dunmore, the village where she'd been born. The village where the Hollis family estate had stood since before her grandfather's grandfather had cleared the land and planted the first stone. She stood at the kitchen counter and read the letter twice before setting it down. Then she put the kettle on, sat at the table, and read it a third time. Her father, Edmund Hollis, had died. He was 91 years old. He had outlived his wife, his oldest son, and, according to the solicitor's careful language, the last of his patients with estate management. The letter requested her presence at a reading of the will at the offices of Ashford and Blythe in Dunmore on the following Thursday, 11 o'clock sharp. Margaret put the letter down and looked out the window at the narrow strip of garden behind her flat. A single apple tree she'd planted 6 years ago, still young enough to be uncertain about its own branches. Her father's estate. She had not been back to Dunmore in 18 years. The last time she had stood in the entrance hall of Hollis House, she had been 55 years old and already invisible. That was the word she had always reached for, not sad, not angry, though both of those were true as well. Invisible, as if the family dynamic had been established so long ago, in such deep grooves, that no one even thought to question it anymore. Margaret was the middle child, the one who hadn't studied law like her older brother Philip, hadn't married well like her younger sister Caroline, hadn't done anything particular to recommend herself in the currency the Hollis family understood. She had painted, watercolors, mostly, and some oils. She had taught art at the village primary school for 31 years and loved it with a completeness that surprised her, the way you sometimes love a life you didn't plan. She had married Gerald Hollis, no relation, who fixed cars and made her laugh and called her Maggie with an accent that dropped every final consonant. They had no children, which had been a sadness once and then became simply a fact, like the color of her eyes. To Philip and Caroline, and especially to Edmund Hollis, all of this had added up to a kind of polite failure. The good daughter in theory, unimpressive in practice. The one who would be provided for, in the vague language they used about such things, when the time came. Which meant, in their particular family's translation of that phrase, given something appropriate to her standing. She drove to Dunmore on the Wednesday night, and stayed at the Swan and Bell on the High Street. The village had changed in the 18 years since she'd left it after the funeral of her mother, who had died quietly and with minimum fuss in the way she had lived. New shop fronts. A coffee place where the fishmonger used to be. The church still the same pale stone it had always been, still surrounded by the same yews, which did not change because yews were older than everyone and had no interest in keeping up with anything. The solicitor's office smelled of wood polish and carpet that had absorbed decades of difficult conversations. Philip was already there when she arrived, 58 and broad-shouldered in a suit that cost more than Margaret's monthly pension. He had their father's jaw. He smiled at her the way you smile at someone you once knew well and have since stopped thinking about. Caroline came in behind her, 64, still slender, her hair the careful blonde of a woman who attends to these things religiously. She kissed Margaret on both cheeks and said, "You look well," which was what people said when they couldn't think of anything accurate. Mr. Ashford was a small, gray-haired man of approximately 70 who wore reading glasses on a cord around his neck and delivered information in the measured, unhurried way of someone who had delivered much worse and survived the room. He expressed condolences. He outlined the estate's general composition. Hollis House and its grounds, 42 acres, the tenant farm on the northern boundary, the investment accounts, the contents of the main house. Then he paused in the particular way that solicitors pause when they are about to say something the room will react to. The estate, excluding one specific parcel, passes jointly to Philip Edmund Hollis and Caroline and Whitfield Hollis, to be managed according to the terms outlined in Schedule 3. Margaret watched Philip's hands relax on the arms of his chair. Caroline uncrossed and recrossed her ankles. The excluded parcel, Mr. Ashford continued, is the property known as Cresswell Mill, including the mill building, the mill pond, the attached land of approximately 1.4 acres, and all structures thereon. This parcel passes solely and entirely to Margaret Rose Hollis. The room went quiet for a moment. Then Philip cleared his throat. The mill hasn't been operational since the 70s. The wheel mechanism's rusted completely. The building's been assessed twice, both times condemned as uninhabitable. Dad kept it on the books because decommissioning it properly would have cost more than it was worth. Caroline turned to look at Margaret with an expression that was trying to be sympathetic and not quite getting there. "You did always say you loved the old place. Do you remember? You used to spend whole afternoons out there when we were small." Margaret said she remembered. She signed the papers that transferred ownership of Cresswell Mill to her name. She shook hands with Mr. Ashford. She walked out of the building into October light that had turned thin and cold while she was inside, and she stood on the pavement of Dunmore High Street and thought about the Watermill. She had loved the old place, that much was true. 40 years ago, she had painted it from every angle, in every season. The wheel, even broken, had a dignity to it. The mill pond caught the light in a particular way in late afternoon, a hammered silver that she had never quite managed to reproduce in paint. The stone walls of the mill building were 3 feet thick in places, local sandstone the color of dried honey. Inside, the old grinding mechanisms still stood, rusted and silent, like the bones of something enormous that had died peacefully in its sleep. Her father had left her the one piece of the estate nobody wanted. Philip had shaken her hand after they left the solicitor's office. A firm, businesslike handshake, the kind he had probably practiced long enough that it felt natural. Caroline had kissed her again and said something about getting together for lunch soon, perhaps in the new year, when everything was settled. Then they had both gone to their separate cars and driven away in separate directions, and Margaret had stood on the pavement for a moment in the cooling afternoon thinking about the particular quality of her family's indifference. It was not cruel, exactly. It was more precise than cruelty. It was the indifference of people who had long ago filed her in the correct drawer and saw no reason to reassess the filing. The mill, Philip had said, with that careful neutrality that meant something else entirely underneath it. The mill hasn't been operational since the 70s. As if this were information she might find useful. As if perhaps she hadn't grown up driving past it, hadn't spent her childhood saturating it with affection. She stood there a moment longer. Then she drove out to it. She drove out to it that afternoon, down the lane that left the village heading west toward the river. The track that turned off toward Cresswell Mill had not been maintained recently. Brambles scraped the sides of her car in 2 places before the mill came into view. It looked worse than she remembered. The roof of the main building had lost a section on the south side, and someone had covered the gap with a blue tarpaulin that had been there long enough to fade and partially disintegrate. The mill pond was choked with reeds along 3/4 of its perimeter. The wheel had lost 2 of its paddles and leaned slightly off its axle as if exhausted. The millrace, the channel that fed water from the river to drive the wheel, was blocked solid with sediment, years of it, the water standing still and dark where it should have been moving. She got out of the car and stood for a moment, letting the place settle around her. The river sound was faint beyond the willows, a low, steady murmur. A heron stood motionless at the edge of the mill pond, watching her with the complete disinterest of a creature that had been standing in such places watching such people for a very long time. The air smelled of cold water and old stone and the particular greenness of moss on north-facing surfaces. She walked around the outside first. The mill pond's near bank had been undermined by years of root growth and had partially collapsed into the water, which was still and dark as old pewter. The millrace channel, which she remembered as a bright rushing thing in childhood, was a blocked trough of black sediment. The willows along the river bank beyond had grown enormous, their trailing branches dragging in the current. She remembered them as small trees, scarcely taller than she was. Now they were the tallest things in the landscape. The stone walls were what they had always been. That much was unchanged. 3 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as they rose. built to last for centuries by men who understood that what they were building would outlive them by a long measure and ought to be done accordingly. The honey-colored sandstone had darkened on the north side where moss had taken hold, but the fabric of it was sound. She could see that even through the dereliction, the bones were good. She pressed her hand against the wall. The stone was cold and slightly rough and solid in a way that felt, after everything, like something she could hold on to. Then she walked to the main door. It was padlocked, but the hasp had pulled free from the frame on one side, which meant the padlock was largely ceremonial. She pulled it open. Inside, it was dim and smelled of damp stone and something older beneath that. Dust and iron and the faint, sweet rot of ancient wood. The grinding floor was still intact, the great millstones sitting in their housings, unmoved in 50 years. A wooden ladder led to the upper level where grain had once been stored, but 2 of its rungs were missing and the rest looked provisional. Against the far wall, someone had stacked old fencing posts at some point, and a rusted metal trunk she didn't recognize sat in the corner under a coating of grime. She stood in the middle of the grinding floor and breathed. She was 73 years old. She had a 1-bedroom flat in Hereford. She had £43 in her current account until her pension came through on Friday. She had a 1.4-acre parcel of land with a condemned mill building and a blocked millrace and a pond full of reeds. She should sell it, of course. Even as a ruin, the land alone had some value. A local developer had probably already had his eye on it. She could get 60, maybe 70,000, clear her small debts, put the rest somewhere sensible, live out what remained quietly and without fuss. She stood there a few more minutes. Then she went back to the Swan and Bell and called her oldest friend, a woman named Ruth who had known her since they were both 22 and teaching in the same school, and she told her about the inheritance. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to sell it?" "I don't know yet. You loved that place once. I was young once too. I've lost plenty of things I loved." Ruth said nothing for a moment, which was one of the things Margaret had always valued about her. She didn't fill silences just because they existed. "What's your gut telling you?" Ruth said finally. "My gut is 73 years old. Your gut has always been smarter than your head. What's it saying?" Margaret looked at the ceiling of the hotel room. Water stain in the corner. Old plaster. Not so different from the ceiling of the mill. "It's saying there's something wrong about the way Philip wasn't upset," she said. "He made that face. The one he makes when he already knows the answer to something and is pretending he doesn't." Ruth said, "You should stay." She stayed. She called the letting agent in Hereford from the hotel the next morning and asked about subletting her flat for 3 months, which she'd always had the right to do under her lease and had never used. Then she called a man named Barry Pierce, who had been the Hollis family's general handyman for about 30 years and who she'd always liked because he had no talent for pretense. Barry came out to the mill that afternoon and walked the property with her in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime reading buildings honestly. He checked the roof joists, poked at the window frames, looked at the wheel mechanism, tested the millrace channel with a stick. He was 67, shorter than she remembered, with the hands of a man who had built and repaired things his whole life. "Structurally, the walls are sound," he said. "They built things properly in the 1700s. That roof section needs replacing, but it's not catastrophic. The wheel, I could get that moving again. Most of the mechanism is seized, but not destroyed. The millrace is the biggest job. That'll want a mini excavator for a day, maybe 2. He paused. "You planning on milling flour?" "No. I'm planning on staying here while I figure out what I'm doing." He looked at the building. Looked at her. "You know Philip came out here in the summer." She turned. "What?" Barry looked slightly uncomfortable, the way people look when they realize they've said something the person in front of them didn't know. "Twice, I think. Had a man with him. Young fellow with a laptop. They walked around outside, went in the building, came back out again. Didn't speak to me about it, but my workshop's just over the back hedge. I saw them." "What was he looking for?" Barry shook his head. "Couldn't say, but they spent a fair bit of time in there. And the second time, they were measuring something inside." Margaret looked at the mill for a long moment. "What would you need to make this habitable? Enough to live in for a few months?" He told her. It was a number that made her wince, but not recoil. She had a small amount left from Gerald's life insurance, sitting in an account she'd never quite found the right reason to touch. It was enough. Not comfortably, but enough. "Right then," she said. "Let's start with the roof." The first 2 weeks were physically harder than she had anticipated. Barry brought in 2 young men from the village to help with the heavy work, and Margaret worked alongside them every day, not swinging hammers necessarily, but carrying, fetching, making tea, filling skips with debris, and in the doing of it, discovering that her body was still capable of more than she had lately given it credit for. She ached in the evenings. She slept without dreaming. She ate simple food and stopped thinking about Philip's face in the solicitor's office every hour or so, which was progress. The flat roof was repaired in 4 days. The windows were reglazed in 3. Barry rigged a temporary kitchen using a camping stove and a single cold tap connected to the old mains pipe, which still ran to the property. A small wood-burning stove in the corner of what had been the miller's living quarters, a single ground-floor room with a low ceiling and a deep windowsill, was unblocked and found to draw beautifully, which cheered her disproportionately. She moved in on a Monday, sleeping in a single bed she'd bought from the local charity shop, under 2 quilts from the same source. The sound at night was water, very faint, from the river beyond the mill pond, and wind in the willows along the bank, and occasionally something settling in the old building with a soft creak that could have been alarming in another mood, but wasn't. She painted. She set up a board in the window of the living room and worked each morning while the light was good. The mill, the pond, the wheel. The way the reeds caught the low autumn sun. She hadn't painted seriously in 4 years, since Gerald's illness had consumed everything, and now it came back not with the grand feeling she might have expected, but with a quiet normality, like reopening a book you'd left, face down on a table, and finding the story exactly where you left it. The painting helped her think. It always had. When her hands were busy with brushwork, something underneath went quiet, and she could hear herself more clearly. She thought about the will, about the specific words Mr. Ashford had used, excluding one specific parcel, not excluding the least valuable parcel, not excluding the marginal property, but one specific parcel, as if the specificity itself were the point. She thought about the locked study in Hollis House, which she had never been allowed inside as a child. Her father's private room, not to be disturbed. She had assumed that was standard for fathers of his generation. Perhaps it had been. Perhaps it hadn't. She thought about the solicitor's expression when he read out the will. Not the practiced neutrality she might have expected, but something slightly more careful. As if he were delivering information he had been asked to deliver in a particular way. She thought about Philip measuring things inside the mill on his second visit. She kept painting. The wheel. The reeds. The dark water. Ruth came for a weekend and brought 2 bottles of wine and a collection of practical opinions about what Margaret was doing. She walked around the property, asked questions, pulled at loose mortar with her finger, peered into the mill pond. "You know what this needs?" she said eventually. "A structural engineer and a small miracle. That too. But I meant someone who knows about old mills. The mechanisms, the history. Have you spoken to anyone?" Margaret hadn't. "There's a society," Ruth said. "Heritage Mills, or some such. I'll find you the name." She found the name. The Society for the Preservation of Working Mills, based in Bristol, who responded to Margaret's email within 48 hours with an enthusiasm that suggested they did not receive many inquiries about Cresswell Mill, but were very pleased to receive this one. A man named Peter Garland, their regional assessor for the Southwest and Marches, would be happy to visit at her convenience. He arrived on a Friday morning in early November, 50-odd, with a beard and the bearing of a man who had spent a great deal of time in buildings other people had given up on. He brought a clipboard and a torch and moved through the mill with the kind of quiet attention that Margaret recognized from good teachers and good doctors, the people who looked at things properly before speaking. He emerged from the grinding floor onto the external platform where the wheel sat and crouched down to examine the axle housing. His expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. "When was this last assessed?" he said. She told him what Philip had said in the solicitor's office. Twice condemned in recent decades. And before that, she didn't know. He stood and looked at the wheel for a long time. Then he said, "I'd like to look at the space beneath the grinding floor, if you don't mind." She said she didn't know there was a space beneath the grinding floor. He showed her the access point, which she had walked past a dozen times without registering it. A heavy iron ring set flush into the stone flags near the eastern wall. He pulled it up, and beneath it, stone steps descended into darkness. He switched on his torch. She switched on the one she'd been carrying in her coat pocket since Barry had started drilling holes in walls. The Undercroft was low-ceilinged and cool, built of the same sandstone as the walls above. It ran the full length of the building, perhaps 15 feet wide and 8 feet from floor to ceiling, with stone piers supporting the grinding floor above. It smelled of cold and minerals and something else, something that took her a moment to place. Undisturbed air. The smell of sealed space. Peter Garland walked the length of it, shining his torch along the walls. Then he stopped at the far end and stood very still. Margaret came up beside him. The far wall was different from the others. She could see it now that she was looking. The same sandstone, the same rough-cut blocks, but newer. Not 17th century. Perhaps 100 years old, perhaps less. The blocks had been fitted with more precision than the rest of the Undercroft, the joints tight and regular, and the mortar between them was a slightly different shade of gray. "Someone built a wall in here," she said. Peter Garland turned his torch to the side and directed the beam at the junction between the new wall and the old. Then he crouched and examined the base of the wall, running his fingers along the lowest course of stone. "The original Undercroft would have been about 4 feet longer than this," he said, "based on the external dimensions of the building." He stood. Someone sealed off the end section, and they knew what they were doing. The construction quality is quite good. When? He studied the mortar again. He looked at the stone. He said, carefully, mid-20th century. Possibly wartime, possibly shortly after. This is speculation. She stood in front of the sealed wall in the cold Undercroft of a mill her father had left her as the least valued piece of his estate, and she thought about Philip measuring things on his second visit. She thought about the face he'd made in the solicitor's office. She thought about a man who had lived to 91 with a secret he'd never told his least favorite child. "What's on the other side of that wall?" she said. Peter Garland looked at her steadily. "I don't know, but I think that might be the right question. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." She didn't break the wall that day or that week. That restraint cost her more than she had expected. Every morning, she went down the iron steps into the Undercroft with her torch and stood in front of the sealed section and counted the courses of stone. 11 courses high, 32 blocks across. Somebody had carried those blocks down here, mixed that mortar, laid those courses level and plumb in a space with no natural light. It wasn't a casual act. It was an act of commitment and deliberateness and, she thought, urgency. She also found herself standing in front of it and doing something else. Listening. Not for sounds, because there were no sounds. Only the faint drip of the river in wet weather and the occasional creak of the building settling. She was listening in the way you sometimes listen when you believe a thing has weight to it, when you believe it carries something that is not merely physical. Her grandfather had built that wall. She had very few memories of him, a large, quiet man who smelled of tobacco and wool and who had died when she was 11, leaving behind a wife who lived another 30 years and never seemed diminished by his absence in the way Margaret had always imagined widowhood would feel. He had been a farmer and a builder and a man of very few words, and someone, at some point between 1943 and 1944, had trusted him with something extraordinary, and he had done what he promised. She thought about that quality of a person, the willingness to keep a thing kept, to hold a promise across years and then decades, to maintain it even when the person you made it to was gone and the world had changed around it, and there was no longer anyone to hold you to account. She had not thought about her grandfather much in her adult life. She had thought about her father, the absence of his approval, the specific shape of his indifference. She had thought less about the generation before that, who had built what her father inherited. She thought about it now. What kind of man built that wall? What kind of man made that promise in 1943 and kept it for the rest of his life, and then left it to his son to keep, and watched his son keep it for another 50 years, right until the end? She called Barry and asked him to come and look at it. He stood in front of it for a while. Then he said, "I can take this down without touching the structure above. These are non-load bearing. They're just filling a gap." "How long?" "Half a day, maybe less. Depends what's on the other side. If there's pressure or gas build-up, which there won't be," he added at her expression, "I'd want to go carefully." She called Peter Garland and asked whether she needed any kind of permission. He said technically the mill was not listed, which meant she was not bound by heritage restrictions, though he hoped she would document everything carefully regardless of what she found. She said she intended to. She called Ruth. "I'm going to open the wall," Ruth said. I'm coming. I'm not waiting for the weekend. I'll take a personal day. Ruth arrived on Thursday morning with a flask of coffee and her reading glasses and a camera she'd borrowed from her nephew. Peter Garland arrived 20 minutes later with his clipboard and a colleague, a young woman named Diana who was apparently a specialist in historic building fabric and who wore her hair in a plait and took photographs of everything with quiet efficiency. Barry arrived with 2 young lads, as he always did for heavy work, and a set of cold chisels and a lump hammer. They went down at 10 in the morning. Barry worked methodically, removing mortar from the joints and lifting each block individually rather than knocking the wall. He did not rush, and Margaret did not ask him to. Each block came out and was handed back along a human chain to be stacked carefully on the grinding floor above through the hatch. Diana photographed every stage. Peter made notes. Ruth stood beside Margaret at the back of the small group and said nothing, which was the right thing. The wall was 2 courses thick. The inner face of each block, as it came out, was clean and dry, which confirmed what Peter had suspected about the sealed conditions behind it. No moisture, no intrusion. The chamber behind had been well chosen. The deepest, most sheltered section of the Undercroft, protected by the full thickness of the mill's northern wall from outside temperature fluctuations, maintained at a natural constant by the surrounding earth and stone. It took 2 hours from the first chisel strike to the last block removal. The chamber did not disappoint. The air that moved through the gap when enough blocks had come out smelled of nothing offensive, nothing alarming. Cold stone, faint mineral, dry wood. The smell of a place that had been asked to keep a thing safe and had simply got on with the task. Barry put his head through the gap and swept the torch. Then he was still for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Hollis, you need to see this." The chamber beyond the wall was approximately 12 feet long and 9 feet wide, the sealed end of the original Undercroft. It was bone dry, the sandstone walls unchanged by moisture, and it was not empty. Against the walls on 3 sides, wooden crates were stacked. Old crates, slatted timber, many of them marked with faded stenciling. Some had lids secured with iron clasps. Others had been sealed with wax along their joints, the wax yellowed but still intact. There were perhaps 30 of them, varying in size. On the floor between the crates, wrapped carefully in oilskin and laid flat, were a series of rectangular shapes that she could not yet identify. In the center of the floor, a single item sat alone, as if deliberately placed, a tin box, the kind used for documents or personal effects, with a small padlock that had rusted but not failed. Margaret stood in the entrance to the chamber and looked at it all for a long time. Ruth's hand found her shoulder. Diana's camera was clicking somewhere behind her. Peter had gone perfectly still. Margaret was aware, in that moment, of something that she did not have good language for. Not triumph, not vindication, though perhaps those things were in there. Something quieter than either of those. The feeling of a question finally revealing that it had always been a question, that the silence she had grown up inside had not been the absence of things but the presence of things carefully kept out of sight. Her father had known. Her grandfather had known. And her father, at the end of his 91 years, had decided that the person he trusted with what was in this chamber was the daughter he had spent most of his life overlooking. She stepped over the threshold and walked to the tin box. The padlock came apart in Barry's hands when he applied gentle pressure. Inside the tin, wrapped in waxed paper, were 2 items: a small leather-bound notebook with a date written on the cover in faded ink, and a single folded letter sealed with plain wax, the seal unbroken. The handwriting on the letter was her father's. She would have known it anywhere. The broad, slightly imperious letters of Edmund Hollis, written in the black ink he had always used. And the name on the front of the letter, written in those familiar strokes, was hers. Margaret. She held it in both hands and was aware of Ruth putting a hand on her shoulder and was grateful for the weight of it. The date written on the notebook's cover was 1943, the year her father had been born. She did not open the letter in the chamber. She went upstairs to the living room of the mill, sat on the edge of her single bed, and held the letter in her hands for a long moment. The light through the window was the low, pale light of a November afternoon. The mill pond was visible from where she sat, the reeds dark and still. Ruth sat in the single chair across from her, holding her coffee in both hands. Peter and Diana were still in the Undercroft, documenting carefully. Barry and his lads had gone home, which Barry had judged correctly was the right thing to do. She broke the seal. The letter was 2 pages long, written in her father's hand, dated 6 months earlier, which meant he had written it before his final decline, when he was 90 years old and presumably still in full possession of himself. She read it once, quickly, the way you read something when your heart is going fast. Then she read it again, slowly, because she owed it that. The handwriting was her father's without question, but it was the handwriting of an old man. The broad, slightly imperious letters she remembered had become smaller, more careful, as if he were conserving something. The ink in a few places had blurred where the hand had rested, and she found that detail difficult to look at. When she finished, she folded it and held it in her lap and looked out at the mill pond for a while. "Well?" Ruth said. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "He knew. He always knew what was down there." Ruth said nothing. He inherited the mill from his own father, who sealed the chamber in 1944. There was a man, a Jewish art dealer from Vienna who'd come to England in 1938. His name was David Eisenberg. He'd got out with as much as he could carry, and what he could carry was his inventory. He came to Dunmore because he knew someone here, a friend of a friend. He needed somewhere to store what he'd brought until the war was over, and he could go back or go somewhere else and start again. Ruth's face had changed. He brought it to the mill. My grandfather agreed to keep it. He built the chamber and sealed it in 1944 when it started to look like David Eisenberg wasn't going to survive to come back for it. She stopped. He was in the camps. He didn't come back. The fire in the small stove had burned low. Outside, the light had gone fully from the mill pond. The reeds along the bank were dark shapes against the dark water, and the heron, if it was still there, was invisible. Margaret sat with the letter in her lap and let the silence hold for a moment. Her father had lived with this for 50 years. He had woken up every morning with the knowledge of what was in that chamber and had spent each day deciding not to act, not to open it, not to pursue the question of who David Eisenberg had been and what had happened to his family, and whether anyone was alive to receive what had been trusted to this mill in 1943. He had decided that inaction was its own form of keeping faith. Or perhaps he had told himself that. Perhaps he had been afraid. Perhaps those two things were the same. The letter said he was sorry. It said he should have acted. It said he had hoped she would understand that he had done what he could when he could, and that giving her the mill was his way of finishing what he had not been brave enough to finish himself. She thought about that word. Brave. Her father had not been a man who used it about himself, ever. She had not heard him apply it to anyone else, either, except once, standing over her mother's hospital bed in the last days. A word so quiet she had almost missed it. She had not forgotten it. My grandfather, and then my father kept it. Waiting for someone to come and claim it. No one ever did. She paused again. That's what Philip was measuring. He figured it out somehow, or he was told. He was going to contest the will, claim the mill should be part of the joint estate. He'd had it assessed. Ruth said quietly, "And your father gave it to you instead. He says in the letter that he should have given it to me years ago. He says he was afraid of what opening it would mean. The legal complications. The questions about what happened to David Eisenberg's family, whether there was anyone left to claim it. He says he spent his whole life waiting for someone to come, and he told himself it was out of respect, and he says," she paused, "he says he thinks it was out of cowardice, and that he's sorry." She folded the letter again. "He left it to me because he knew I wouldn't sell it. He knew I'd try to find out the truth of it." Ruth came and sat beside her on the bed without being asked, and they sat there together while the afternoon light failed over the mill pond, and the chamber below them waited in the dry dark with its 30 years of sealed cargo. Peter Garland knocked on the door half an hour later, quietly. She let him in. He stood in the middle of her small living room and looked at her carefully. "I've done a preliminary inventory," he said. "I haven't touched anything or opened anything, but I can see enough through the slatted sides of some of the crates." She waited. He said, "There are paintings, framed works, wrapped in cloth in several of the oilskin parcels. There are books, what look like rare or collector's editions from the stenciling on some of the crates. There are several cases that look like they may contain smaller objects, possibly decorative pieces, silverwork perhaps, or collectibles." He paused. "And there is one crate at the back left corner that is heavier than the others, by the way the floorboards respond, and it is sealed differently. Lead-lined, I think." She looked at him. What was David Eisenberg's specialty? He said. She picked up the notebook from the bed and opened it to the first page. where a single line had been written in a careful hand she didn't recognize. Not her grandfather's, not her father's. Smaller, more precise, the handwriting of a man who spent his life cataloging. Below the line, the rest of the notebook was filled with dense, numbered entries. Titles, dates, dimensions, names she half recognized and names she didn't. She read the first line aloud. Inventory of Works in Trust, Cresswell Mill, Dunmore. D. Eisenberg, September 1943. Peter Garland sat down in the single chair. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the ceiling. He said, almost to himself, "Right." Ruth looked between them. "How serious is this?" Peter said, "I don't know yet. But if the inventory matches what I've seen, this is not small. This could be very significant." He spoke carefully, the way people speak when they are choosing their words to avoid raising expectations they cannot yet justify. But Margaret had watched his face when he came back up from the chamber after his preliminary inspection, and she had seen something in it beyond professional assessment. A kind of stillness that came from confronting something larger than anticipated. She had gone back down herself after he came up. Ruth had stayed at the top of the steps, saying she preferred her feet on solid ground, which was fair. Peter had offered to come with her, but she had gone alone, taking her torch, and stood in the gap where the wall had been and let the beam fall slowly over what was there. The crates were old and solid and made of a pale which she did not recognize, slotted planks with iron banding at the corners. Some had rope handles. A few had been reinforced with additional corner pieces, suggesting their contents were fragile or heavy or both. The stenciling on the sides was faded and in some cases entirely obscured, but in the torchlight, she could make out partial letters on the cleaner surfaces. Numbers. What might have been gallery names or dealer marks. The oilskin parcels on the floor were wrapped with care that was obvious even after 80 years. Whoever had wrapped them had taken time with the folding and the securing, had used cord that was still intact in most places, had laid each one flat with the deliberateness of someone who expected them to be undisturbed for a considerable period and wanted them in the same condition when the period was over. They ranged in size from something not much larger than a book to one that was taller than she was and required 2 lengths of oilskin overlapping at the center. She had stood in front of that largest one for a long time. Then she had turned her torch to the lead-lined crate at the back left corner, the one Peter had mentioned. It was different from the others in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Smaller, lower, set directly on the stone floor rather than on wooden battens like the others. The lid was fastened with 4 bolts, not clasps, and the joints between lid and body had been sealed with something that had set hard and dark over the decades. She did not touch it. She stood in that chamber in the cold, dry air that had been sealed since 1944, and she looked at everything and did not touch any of it. And she thought about a man named David Eisenberg, 30 or 40 years old in 1943, who had carried these things from Vienna to England on the understanding that the world would stabilize itself eventually and he would come back for them. And who had not come back? What had he thought about in the camp? She was not the right person to imagine that, and she knew it. But she thought about the moment of sealing the crates and wrapping the oilskins and writing the inventory in his careful hand and handing the key of this building to her grandfather and driving away. Whether he had believed, in that moment, that it was temporary. Whether he had held on to that belief. She hoped he had. Margaret turned the notebook pages carefully. The entries ran for 43 pages. She counted the numbered items in the first section, 62 separate entries. 62 items, she said. Peter nodded. Each entry was numbered and titled and given dimensions and a medium and dated. Some entries had additional notations in a smaller hand, presumably added later, that she could not immediately decipher. The dates of the works ranged from the 15th century to 1937, the year before David Eisenberg had left Vienna. She recognized perhaps a third of the names in the medium column: oil on canvas, watercolor on paper, gouache, pen, and ink. Some entries listed other categories: silver, bronze, ceramic, manuscript. The first entry on the first page read, Number 1. Landscape with river and figures, oil on panel, 48 by 62 centimeters, attributed Flemish school, circa 1620. Acquired Vienna, 1931. She looked at that single entry for a long time. Then she looked at the 61 others waiting in their numbered sequence. She thought about her father's letter. She thought about 90 years of waiting and not knowing and being afraid. She thought about David Eisenberg, who had packed what he could carry into a car or a van or whatever he had, who had driven through a Europe already folding in on itself toward catastrophe, who had arrived in this quiet Herefordshire village with his life's work and trusted it to strangers, and then did not come back to retrieve it. She thought about Philip's face. "I'll need a solicitor," she said. "Someone with experience in cultural restitution and provenance law." Peter nodded slowly. "I know someone in London. She's done this work before. And someone who can tell me whether David Eisenberg had family, whether there are heirs." He nodded again. "That's the right question to ask first." She looked down at the notebook in her hands and thought about all the things she did not yet know but was about to learn. The weight of the oilskin parcels against the stone floor below. The names written in the precise, careful hand of a man who had trusted that his inventory would mean something to someone, eventually, when the world steadied itself enough to be worth returning to. She had been given a condemned mill on 1.4 acres of land beside a blocked millrace. She had been given the least wanted piece of an estate built on 70 years of old money and family assumption. She was 73 years old. She had £43 in her current account. She had a one-bedroom flat she was subletting and a single bed in a mill living room and a fire that needed stoking. And somewhere below her feet, in a sandstone chamber sealed in 1944 by a grandfather she remembered only as a set of large hands and a smell of tobacco, 62 items waited in the dark to be returned to the world. She turned to the second page of the inventory and began to read. Ruth left on Sunday evening after insisting on cooking a proper meal, which in practice meant warming a tin of soup on the camping stove and adding bread she'd bought from the bakery in Dunmore, but which felt, in the circumstances, like something considerably more than that. She hugged Margaret at the door of the mill, held on for a moment longer than usual, and said, "Call me tomorrow morning." Margaret said she would. She watched the headlights of Ruth's car disappear down the track, and then she went inside and sat at the small table with David Eisenberg's inventory notebook open in front of her and read it from the beginning. It took 3 hours. She read slowly, because she wanted to understand what she was reading, and because some of the entries were dense with information she had no immediate framework for. Names she didn't know. Descriptions in German occasionally mixed with English. Numbers she could not yet evaluate. But she read all of it, every entry, every notation, and when she finished she turned back to the first page and read the line that David Eisenberg had written at the top before the inventory began. It said, in English, "These works are held in trust at Cresswell Mill, Dunmore, Herefordshire, England, in the care of Mr. Thomas Hollis, pending my return or the direction of my heirs. All items were legally acquired and are the property of D. Eisenberg, Vienna, and London." She read that last sentence twice. Legally acquired. He had known, even then, even while packing in whatever urgency or grief or determination had driven him, that the word legal would matter later. That someone would need to know he had bought these things, not taken them. He had been a dealer. An honest man in an honest trade who had spent his career acquiring things of beauty and selling them, and acquiring more. The inventory was not the record of theft or confiscation. It was a business ledger, maintained with the same conscientiousness he would have brought to any ordinary year. Except that 1943 was not an ordinary year, and the chamber beneath the Herefordshire Watermill was not an ordinary stockroom. She closed the notebook and put her hand flat on its cover for a moment. Then she went to bed and slept without difficulty, which surprised her when she woke and thought about it. Peter Garland called at 8 in the morning, which was early for a courtesy call, and told her his mind had been working overnight the same way hers had. "I've spoken to my colleague at the society," he said. "She agrees the documentation needs to be handled carefully. There are protocols for this kind of find, particularly given the provenance context. I've taken the liberty of sending a preliminary note to Helena Voss in London. She's the restitution solicitor I mentioned yesterday. She's responded already. She'd like to speak with you today if possible." She said yes. Helena Voss called 40 minutes later from a number with a London code. Her voice was direct and clear and carried the particular quality of someone who had spent a long time on the telephone with people in distressed or complicated circumstances and had learned to be precise without being cold. She asked Margaret to describe what she had found, and she listened without interrupting while Margaret did so. When Margaret finished, Helena asked 3 questions. The first was about the condition of the notebook. The second was about whether the chamber had been disturbed before today. The third was about the lead-lined crate. Margaret answered all three. Helena said, I'd like to come to the mill this week, before any of the crates are opened and before anything is removed from the chamber. I'll explain why when I'm there, but the short version is that documentation of provenance needs to happen in sequence, and the sequence matters legally, particularly if there are surviving heirs to David Eisenberg. Do you think there might be? There's a reasonable chance. He left Vienna in 1938 with enough notice to organize this. That means he had some time before the worst of it. He may have had family members who also got out through different routes. It's also possible that he left a will or a record of the inventory in another location that we've never found because no one knew what they were looking for. When you have the notebook, you have the key to a search that may have never been properly started. Margaret said. He wrote legally acquired at the top of the first page. Helena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's characteristic. Many of the dealers we work with in these cases were meticulous about documentation. They knew the law. They lived by it. That sentence is the kind of thing a man writes when he is afraid the law will be used against him later, against his memory or his family's claim, and he wants to leave no room for doubt. She came on the Wednesday. Helena Voss was small and dark-haired and moved quickly in the way of someone whose time had always been worth more than it appeared. She was perhaps 50. With reading glasses, she wore pushed up on her head and brought down frequently to look at things, and she carried a case that turned out to contain a laptop, a portable document scanner, and several rolls of archival quality tissue paper. She had driven from London that morning. She ate the sandwich Margaret offered her standing at the kitchen counter while reading the notebook, then went down to the Undercroft without being asked and spent an hour taking photographs and making notes. When she came back up, she put the reading glasses on the table and sat down and said, All right, I need to tell you what I think is likely here, and I need to be clear that it is preliminary and that I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. She explained that David Eisenberg was not an unknown name in the field of art restitution. There was a partial record of his activities in pre-war Vienna. He had operated a gallery on the Dorotheergasse, which had been one of the significant streets for art dealing in the city before the Anschluss. Several works that had passed through his gallery had been traced and restituted over the decades following the war, but those were works he had sold before leaving. The records of his personal collection and inventory, the things he had retained rather than sold, had been incomplete. Researchers had suspected he had taken inventory with him when he fled. They had not known where it had gone. She looked at Margaret steadily. There are people who have been looking for this for a long time, she said. Not to claim it personally, but researchers, institutions, the family, if there is family. The commission that deals with looted art in Austria has an open file on Eisenberg's inventory, or it did 10 years ago when I last checked. I'd be surprised if that's changed. Margaret said, He wasn't robbed. He stored it willingly. I know. But the legal situation is still complex because the chain of custody has been informal and undocumented for 80 years. Your grandfather and your father held these items in good faith, by the sound of it. But they held them without any formal legal arrangement. No deed of trust, no registered storage agreement. Which means that when we establish the full picture and establish whether heirs exist, there may be conversations to have about the terms of the return. She said return as if it were the only possible conclusion, which Margaret appreciated. She asked about Philip. Helena nodded at the question as if she had been expecting it. Has he been in contact since the will reading? A solicitor's letter arrived on the Tuesday after, putting her on notice that he intended to challenge the will on the grounds that their father had lacked capacity and been improperly influenced by persons unknown. The letter was written in the kind of language that was meant to sound alarming and probably was alarming to people who didn't know solicitors' letters well enough to read past the language to the substance. Ruth had read it and said it sounded like a man who knew he couldn't win and was making noise anyway. He may be more motivated than he appears, Helena said. If he had the mill assessed before the will reading, someone told him there was something of value here. He may not know exactly what, but he knows enough to be concerned that he's been cut out of something significant. How significant? Helena looked at the notebook. She looked at the list of items again. Then she looked at the fire in the stove. If the physical condition of the works matches the age and quality suggested by the inventory, she said carefully, and if the attributions hold under expert review, which some of them will not, they never do, but if the majority hold, then you are talking about a collection that would have been worth several £1 million when it was put into that chamber in 1943. 80 years of art market inflation has a compound effect that is difficult to overstate. She paused. Significant is probably not the right word. I wouldn't want to give you a number today because it would be wrong and possibly embarrassingly conservative. Margaret sat with that for a moment. And it belongs to his heirs, she said. Helena looked at her. If they can be found and verified, yes. The legal principle in cases like this is restitution to the family where possible. You won't be able to simply sell the collection or keep it. But, she said, and there was something careful in the way she said it, the people who establish the find and facilitate the return of looted or hidden works in cases like this are not simply left with nothing. There are finder's rights in some jurisdictions. There are moral claims that courts recognize. There is also the possibility that an heir, if found, might choose to make a settlement to the person whose family kept the collection safe for 80 years at no financial benefit to themselves. She paused again. That's not a promise. It's a possibility. The most important thing, the thing I would urge you to hold on to, is that doing this correctly and honestly will protect you regardless of the financial outcome. If you try to obscure the provenance or sell anything quietly, you will be in serious legal jeopardy. If you do this transparently and in full cooperation with the relevant authorities, your position is sound. She understood. She had already understood, but it helped to hear it said. They spent the rest of the day working through the inventory together, Helena cross-referencing entries against databases she accessed on her laptop, Margaret following along and asking questions that Helena answered fully and without impatience. Two of the entries in the first section match descriptions of works that appeared in Eisenberg's Dorotheergas records. A third matched something described in a 1955 Austrian registry of items believed to have left the country before the war. Helena made a quiet sound when she found that third match. This entry, she said, pointing. Number 17. Wooded landscape with hunters, oil on canvas, attributed to the workshop of Jan Bruegel the Younger. If the attribution is correct, this painting has an estimated value in current auction records of between £400,000 and £700,000. Margaret looked at the entry. 48 by 63 centimeters. A modest size. Something that would fit comfortably on an ordinary wall. Something that had been sitting in a sandstone chamber in Herefordshire since 1943. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Helena found another match before the evening was out. Entry number 31. A small oil on copper, Dutch school, early 17th century, depicting a kitchen interior with figures. It had appeared in the catalogue of a Vienna auction in 1934 where Eisenberg had purchased it. It had been sought by a private collector's family since the 1990s, who had last traced it to Eisenberg's gallery and then lost the thread. How many other entries might have matches like this? Margaret said. Helena sat back. That's what I need proper time to establish. The database work alone will take weeks. Then there is the physical examination of the works themselves, which will need a conservator. Then there are the attributions to verify with art historians. This isn't a process measured in days. She looked at Margaret. That said, the question you should be most focused on right now is the heirs. The legal status of everything else depends on that answer. She had begun the search herself, quietly, the night before Helena arrived. She had sat at the small table with her laptop, the signal coming and going as it always did out here by the river, and she had typed the name David Eisenberg Vienna into a search. There was more than she had expected. He appeared in several Holocaust research databases. Born 1901 in Vienna. Trained as an art historian at the University of Vienna before establishing his dealership. The gallery at the Dorotheergas had operated from 1927 until the Anschluss in 1938. After 1938, his records were sparse, as they were for so many people. He appeared in one transport list dated 1942, his name among hundreds of others, and after that the official records ended with the finality that official records used in that period, which was no finality at all, just cessation. But there was something else. A footnote in an academic paper from 2003, a survey of Viennese art dealers and their fates, that noted David Eisenberg's sister Clara had emigrated to Britain in 1937 and was believed to have settled somewhere in the south of England. The paper's author had been unable to trace her further. She had sat with that footnote for a while. Clara Eisenberg, she had typed. Britain, 1937. The search had given her very little that night, but it had given her a direction. Helena read the footnote when Margaret showed her. Clara, she said quietly. If Clara survived and had children, those children are in their 70s or 80s now. If they had children, those grandchildren are your generation or younger. This is entirely possible. This is the most promising thing you've shown me. She gave Margaret the name of a genealogical researcher in London who specialized in tracing displaced families from the 30s and 40s. His name was Gerald Frisch, which Margaret found quietly remarkable, her late husband's name on the man who might find David Eisenberg's living family. She didn't say this to Helena, but she turned the coincidence over in her mind that evening after Helena left. Before she left, Helena stood in the doorway of the mill for a moment looking at the Undercroft hatch in the floor of the grinding room. She said, "Your family kept those things safe for 80 years. That's not nothing. Whatever the legal process determines about ownership and restitution, that fact exists independently. It matters." Margaret said she hoped it did. Helena said, "I've done this work for 20 years. Families who've kept things safe, who've acted in good faith and maintained that faith across generations without any material reward, they're rarer than you'd think. Most of the cases I handle involve bad faith somewhere in the chain. Concealment for profit. Sale to buyers who didn't ask the right questions. Deliberate obscuring of provenance. Your grandfather built a wall and kept a promise to a man who never came back. Your father kept the promise after him. That's the story here, alongside everything else." She drove away in the dusk, the lane closing behind her headlights. The letter from Philip's solicitors arrived the following morning, which was a Thursday, and was longer and more specific than the first one. It stated that Philip Hollis had obtained evidence suggesting that a significant undisclosed asset existed on the property known as Cresswell Mill, and that their father's decision to exclude the property from the joint estate, while knowing of this asset, constituted a material misrepresentation in the testamentary process. The letter requested that Margaret cease any activity on the property that might damage, remove, or otherwise affect the asset pending resolution of the legal challenge. It also stated that Philip was prepared to pursue the matter through the courts if necessary. She sent the letter to Helena by photograph that afternoon. Helena called within the hour. "This is what I expected. He's trying to establish a claim before the provenance is legally settled, because once the Eisenberg connection is formally documented, his claim becomes very difficult to sustain. The asset, if we can call it that, doesn't belong to the Hollis family regardless of which sibling inherited the property. It belongs to the Eisenberg estate. Philip's lawyers know this, or they will when they investigate properly. So he's fishing," Margaret said. "He's trying to move faster than the evidence," Helena said, "which is what people do when they know the evidence isn't on their side." She called Barry that afternoon and asked him to change the lock on the mill's main door and to add a bolt to the Undercroft access hatch. He came round that evening and did both without asking questions, which she appreciated. When he finished, he stood in the living room for a moment and said, "Philip called me yesterday." She turned. "What did he want?" "Wanted to know if you'd found anything in the building. I told him you'd been repairing the roof and the plumbing." "Did he believe you?" Barry looked out the window at the dark mill pond. "Hard to say. He was using the voice he uses when he wants something. I know that voice from 30 years of working for your father." He added, "I didn't tell him anything useful." "Thank you," she said. He shook his head, a brief dismissal of the thanks. "Your grandfather was a decent man," he said. "Your father was decent enough, in his way. If there's something in this building that needs to come out right, you're the right person to do it." He pulled his jacket on. "Lock the door properly tonight." The first crate was opened on the Saturday. Helena had arranged for a conservator to come down from London, a woman named Isabel Fry, who worked with the National Gallery's Conservation Department and who spoke about paint layers and panel supports the way Barry spoke about roof joists, with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who had spent decades understanding things from the inside out. She brought her own tools, her own lighting, and a portable humidity monitor she set up in the Undercroft before touching anything. Margaret stood back and watched, which took more restraint than she had expected. The urge to be the one to open it was strong, but she understood that the moment of opening needed to belong to the process, not to her impatience. Isabel chose the first crate by size and by what the inventory said it contained. Number 6 on the list, For small format works, oil on panel, described in the inventory as devotional subjects, Flemish, 16th century. The crate was one of the smaller ones, perhaps 2 feet square, and its lid came off with minimal resistance once Isabel worked the clasps. Inside, packed in layers of cloth that had yellowed but remained intact, were 4 paintings. She lifted them out one at a time, setting each on a clean cloth laid over the stone floor, and angled her specialist light on each in turn before touching it further. Each panel was intact, no cracking of the support beyond what would be expected in 80 years. The paint surfaces were obscured by varnish that had gone dark with age, the way old varnish always did, turning what had been clear protection into a yellow-brown fog over the surface. But underneath the varnish, clearly visible at the edges where the fog thinned, were colors. Warm reds, a particular blue that had not faded. Isabel took one of the panels and tilted it under her light, examining the edges of the paint at the picture's border. Then she looked at the back of the panel, at the wood grain, the saw marks, the cradle of wooden strips. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "This is original. This has not been restored or relined or substantially interfered with since it was painted." She looked at the inventory entry. 16th century. That's consistent. Margaret crouched beside her. "It's real?" "The attribution I can't confirm today. That takes time and testing and more expert eyes than mine. But is this a genuine, early Flemish panel painting in extremely good condition?" She looked at it again. Yes. She felt something move through her that she did not have a clean name for. It was not triumph, and it was not simply relief. It was closer to the feeling she got sometimes when a painting resolved under her brush, when the thing she had been reaching for was suddenly there, and the distance between what she had attempted and what she had achieved was smaller than she'd feared. A kind of settling. The confirmation that the effort had been pointed in the right direction all along. Philip called while they were working on the second crate. She stepped outside to take the call, standing on the stone platform by the wheel in the cold November air. His voice on the line was controlled in the way that suggested effort behind the control. "I've heard you've had people from London at the mill," he said. "Who told you that?" "This is a small village, Margaret. People notice things. I've also heard you've been opening the building up, taking things out." "Nothing has been taken out." A conservator looked at 2 items. They were returned to where they came from. A silence. What did she find? She said, "That's not something I can discuss with you, Philip." The silence that followed was different from the first one. Tighter. He said, "I want you to understand something. Dad was 91 years old. He made a decision under circumstances that I believe can be challenged. I'm not doing this to be difficult. I'm doing it because there are things in that property that belong to this family, and I'm not prepared to stand by while you manage them unilaterally." She said, "What belongs to that property doesn't belong to this family. It never did." "What does that mean?" She did not answer. He said, and the controlled quality of his voice had thinned, "Margaret, I know there's something down there. I had the building assessed 18 months ago. I know there's a sealed section in the Undercroft, and I have a good idea of what's in it. If you think you can make decisions about that without involving me, you're wrong." She said, "You had our father's property assessed before he died?" A pause. "I was acting in the family's interests." "Whose family?" She went back inside without waiting for his answer. Isabel had the second oilskin parcel partially unwrapped and was directing her raking light across the surface of what was emerging. Margaret stood in the entrance to the Undercroft and watched the face come clear of the cloth and said nothing for a moment. Then she put her phone away and went back to work. The second crate they opened that day was one of the medium-sized ones, number 14 in the inventory. A single canvas, oil, described as portrait of a gentleman, Dutch school, 17th century, 87 by 67 centimeters. It had been wrapped in the oilskin parcels on the floor rather than crated, which meant that when Isabel unwrapped it, the sensation in the Undercroft changed. Even unframed, even under the dark varnish, the scale of it was different from the panels. A face came out of the cloth wrapping, the lower half first, a white collar, then a dark coat, then the face itself, a man of perhaps 50, looking directly outward with the slight downward angle that 17th century Dutch portraitists favored, the eyes carrying the specific quality that the best of those painters achieved, a feeling of presence, of someone actually looking back. The Undercroft was very quiet for a moment. Nobody spoke. Isabel leaned forward and directed her light across the surface at a raking angle that emphasized the paint texture. She moved it slowly from one side to the other. Then she sat back on her heels and put her hands in her lap and looked at the painting with an expression that Margaret could not entirely read. "This quality," Isabel said finally, speaking in the careful way of someone choosing accuracy over excitement, "is not consistent with a workshop production. The handling of the flesh tones," she gestured at the face, "and the collar. The lace," she indicated the intricate white at the throat. "That's not the work of an assistant copying a master's method. That's the work of someone who understood exactly what they were doing." "Do you know who painted it?" Margaret said. Isabel looked at it again. "I have a suspicion. I want to be wrong, because if I'm right, this is going to be a very complicated few months." She turned to look at Margaret. "But I don't think I am." That evening, after Isabel had carefully rewrapped everything and departed with a list of next steps and a promise to return the following week with a colleague from the university, and after Helena had spent another 2 hours cross-referencing inventory entries against her databases, and after both of them had driven back toward their respective lives in London, Margaret sat alone in the Undercroft. She had brought the notebook and her torch and a blanket she'd wrapped around her shoulders against the cold, and she sat on the bottom step of the iron ladder and looked at the chamber. 28 crates, 14 oilskin parcels of various sizes, some of which she now knew contained paintings of a quality she had not been prepared for, even after everything Helena had told her. The lead-lined box at the back, still sealed, still unexamined, still carrying whatever it was carrying. 62 items in total, each of which had been placed here by a man who had died without coming back for them, and each of which was now, 80 years later, being looked at by people who understood their worth in ways that went beyond money. She thought about what Isabel had said about the portrait, the specific way she'd said it. "If I'm right, this is going to be a very complicated few months." She looked up the artist later that night on her laptop, cross-referencing what Isabel had suggested with what the inventory entry said. She found records of missing works from several sources. A museum database from Amsterdam, a private family claim registered in the 1990s, a description that matched the inventory entry in its dimensions, its subject, its medium. The painting had been owned before Eisenberg by a family in Vienna who had sold it to him in 1935. The sale had been recorded. It was a legitimate transaction. After 1935, the painting had disappeared from the historical record entirely, as so many things had in those years, and the museum that had originally housed it before the family acquired it in the 19th century had a note in its provenance file, "Current whereabouts unknown." She closed the laptop and sat in the dark of the mill's living room for a while. Then she called Peter Garland, knowing it was late but trusting that a man who had spent his career in heritage work would understand the kind of phone call that couldn't wait until morning. He answered on the third ring. She said, "Entry number 23 in the inventory. Portrait of a gentleman, Dutch, 17th century. Isabel Fry looked at it today. She thinks she knows who painted it." Peter was quiet for a moment. "Who?" She told him the name. He said nothing for 4 seconds. Then he said, "Margaret. I know. That painting has been missing since 1935. It was assumed destroyed in the war. I know." There was a pause, a longer one this time. She could hear him in the background moving, the sound of a chair, then a window. He said, "If that attribution holds, and it will need to go before a panel for verification, but if it holds, you understand that this changes the interpretation of the rest of the inventory." She said she understood. "It means that what Eisenberg had in this chamber was not simply a good private collection. It means he was keeping works of serious museum quality. The kind of works that the major dealers of the period handled, that moved between private collections and institutions, that carried full provenance trails back to the 17th century. He would have known what he had." She said, "He was a trained art historian. He'd been dealing for over a decade before the war. He knew exactly what he had." Peter said yes. He said it quietly. "And in 1943, Margaret, in 1943, a man who knew exactly what he had still chose to trust a Herefordshire farmer he barely knew with all of it. Because it was the only option he had that wasn't watching it disappear." She looked at the fire. He said, "How are you?" It was an unexpected question from a man whose register had been professional throughout. She considered it. She said, "I don't entirely know. I feel like I've been handed something very heavy and very important, and I'm trying to hold it without dropping it." "That's the right way to feel," he said. "Don't let anyone rush you. The legal process takes the time it takes. The appraisal takes the time it takes. The family, when you find them, they'll need time too. She said. She added a line to the notebook. His sister, Clara, at the bottom of the last entry. He was quiet. She read it to him over the phone. Please remember him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Peter said, That's why you're doing this, right? You understood from the first day that this wasn't about money. You didn't look at 62 inventory entries and calculate. You looked at a man's name and his sister's handwriting, and you understood what you were holding. She said good night and put the phone down and stayed there in front of the fire for another half an hour, not thinking about anything particular, just being in the mill, in the silence of it, in the warmth it had found after 50 years of cold. There were still 26 crates unopened, and the lead line box at the back of the chamber, still sealed, still holding whatever David Eisenberg had considered important enough to protect with lead and 4 bolts in the worst year of his life. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow it would begin to become clear. She went to bed with that thought and the river sound and the slow turning of the wheel. She set the phone down and looked at the fire, which was burning well, the stove drawing cleanly as it had from the first night. The mill was warm around her. The river was its low, continuous presence outside. She thought about her father's letter again. The sentence that had stayed with her most. I spent my whole life waiting for someone to come, and I told myself it was out of respect, and I think it was out of cowardice. She turned that sentence over, the way she sometimes turned a problem over when she was painting, looking for the angle that revealed the thing she hadn't seen. Her father had not been a coward in the ordinary sense of the word. He had been a careful man. A man who weighed risk and found it too heavy, who had made the calculation that the personal cost of opening that chamber, of confronting what was inside it and what it meant, outweighed the benefit of doing what ought to have been done. He had passed that calculation to his son, and his son had quietly agreed. And then, at 91, in what must have been a late and difficult and perhaps frightening revision of a judgment he had held for most of his life, he had changed the terms of the inheritance. He had left the mill to the child who would not calculate, the one who had spent her life not trading in the family's currency of advantage and position, who had taught children to draw and married a mechanic and loved both choices without apology. The one who had painted the mill from every angle for 40 years without knowing what was underneath it. She thought, he knew me better than I thought he did. The search for Clara Eisenberg began the following week, when Gerald Frisch, the genealogical researcher, arrived at the mill with a laptop and a methodology and the particular manner of a man who had done this work many times and understood both its importance and its fragility. He was perhaps 60, with a neatness about his appearance that suggested precision as a value, and he listened to everything Margaret told him about the notebook and the inventory and the footnote from the 2003 paper without writing anything down, which she found slightly unnerving until she realized he was simply absorbing before categorizing. He spent the first day entirely on his laptop, using databases she didn't have access to, cross-referencing against records she didn't know existed. She brought him tea and left him to it. At one point in the afternoon, she looked in and saw him sitting very still, reading something on his screen, and the quality of his stillness was familiar to her now. It was the same stillness she had seen in Peter Garland in the Undercroft, in Isabel Fry with the Dutch portrait, in Helena with the notebook. The stillness that arrived when a person in possession of professional experience encountered something beyond the ordinary range of their professional experience. She did not interrupt him. He ate the soup she made for lunch without comment and returned to work immediately. And at 5 o'clock he came to find her and sat down at the table with the look of a man who had found what he was looking for and was organizing how to say it. He said, Clara Eisenberg arrived in England in September 1937. She entered on a visitor's visa and applied for extended residency in early 1938 when it became clear she would not be going back. She married a man named Arthur Levi in 1941. He was also a Viennese émigré. They settled in Brighton. Margaret sat down. Is she still alive? She died in 1989, but she had 2 children. A son, Daniel Levi, born 1943, and a daughter, Rachel Levi, born 1946. Do you know where they are? Gerald Frisch looked at his notes. Daniel Levi died in 2018, but he had 3 children. His daughter, a woman named Anna Levi, is 61 years old and lives in Bristol. She is a retired architect. She has no known connection to the collection because she has almost certainly never known it existed. Margaret thought about that for a moment. A woman of 61 in Bristol who had grown up without knowing her great-uncle had carried his life's work into an English watermill before the war swallowed him, who had perhaps grown up knowing very little about David at all, or knowing only what Clara had been able to bring herself to say about a brother she had escaped, and he had not. She thought about what it meant to hold a loss like that. Not the ordinary grief of bereavement, which was hard enough, but the particular weight of a loss that had no body, no grave, no fixed point, only an absence that the historical record eventually filled in with a list and a date and the dry machinery of documented horror. Clara had lived until 1989, 44 years with that knowledge. And somewhere in those 44 years, she had perhaps wondered about the collection, about the things David had taken to England before her, about whether any of it had survived. Or perhaps she had been afraid to wonder. Perhaps it had been easier to let that part of him belong to the silence. And Rachel? She said. Rachel Levi is 79. She lives in London. Gerald paused. She has a daughter and 2 grandchildren. 2 surviving lines of the family. 3 generations of people who had been living their ordinary lives, and who did not yet know that somewhere in Herefordshire, in a sandstone chamber beneath a condemned mill that the Hollis family had never thought worth fighting over, David Eisenberg's inventory had been waiting in the cold and the dark for someone to come and tell them. Margaret looked out the window at the mill pond. The wheel was still, as it had been for 50 years, the paddles turning slightly in the current that had started to move again since Barry had done preliminary work on clearing the millrace. Not operational, not yet, but alive in some minor way, responsive again to the water that had once driven it. What do I do now? She said. Gerald Frisch closed his laptop. You contact them. Before the press finds out, before Philip's legal challenge complicates matters, before anything else. You write to them and you explain who you are, and you tell them what your grandfather kept, and what your father kept after him, and what you found. She said, they might be angry that it took this long. He looked at her. They might. Some families are. But in my experience, most of them, when they understand the full circumstances, when they understand that the people who held the works were not profiting from them and were not concealing them with bad intent, most of them are not primarily angry. There's something else. What? He said the word simply, without ceremony, relieved. She looked at the water moving on the mill pond, at the wheel that had begun, very slightly, to turn again. She thought about David Eisenberg writing legally acquired at the top of the first page of the inventory notebook and then packing it into a tin box with a letter he was not yet going to write, leaving a space for a future he couldn't be certain of, trusting that someone, eventually, would find the tin and do what needed doing. She thought about her father leaving her a condemned mill and a sealed chamber and a letter that amounted, in the end, to a very old apology and a request. She picked up her pen. She wrote slowly, crossing out sentences and starting them again in the manner of someone for whom writing was not the natural medium, but who understood the importance of getting the words right this time. She wrote to Anna Levi in Bristol first, on the grounds that she was 61 and that 61 was old enough to absorb difficult news without a second person present, probably, and young enough to drive to Herefordshire in a day if she wanted to. She did not know how to begin, which was honest enough to become the beginning. She wrote, I don't know the right way to start this letter, so I'll start with the facts and you can read them in whatever order makes most sense to you. She wrote about her grandfather, Thomas Hollis, who had made a promise to a man named David Eisenberg in the autumn of 1943 and had kept it. She wrote about the Undercroft and the sealed wall and the tin box and what the tin box contained. She wrote about the inventory notebook with its 43 pages of numbered entries, and about Helena Voss and Isabel Fry and what they had found when they looked at the first 2 crates. She wrote carefully about what she did not yet know, which was a great deal. She did not yet know the full scope or value of the collection. She did not know the legal process that would govern the return of the works to the family, though she had engaged a solicitor experienced in exactly this kind of case. She did not know whether there would be complications or whether the process would be simple. What she did know, and wrote plainly, was that nothing in the collection would be sold or moved or disposed of without the full knowledge and agreement of the Eisenberg family, that it had been kept safe for 80 years and would continue to be kept safe for however long the legal and appraisal process required, that it was there, in the same condition it had been in when David Eisenberg placed it there, and that it was waiting for the family he had left behind. She hesitated over the last paragraph for a long time. Then she wrote, "Your great-uncle did something remarkable in 1943. He trusted strangers with the most valuable things he possessed, in the middle of a situation that offered him very few good choices. My grandfather honored that trust. My father honored it after him, imperfectly and with more fear than courage, as he acknowledged at the end of his life. I'm trying to honor it now. I hope that counts for something." She signed it Margaret Rose Hollis, Cresswell Mill, Dunmore, Herefordshire, and put it in an envelope and addressed it in her clearest handwriting to a woman in Bristol who did not yet know her life was about to change. Then she sat for a while with her hands flat on the table. The fire in the stove needed another log. Outside, the river moved in its low continuous way, and the wheel turned its slight, tentative quarter turn and stopped and turned again. The mill sat around her with its 300-year-old walls and its dry Undercroft and its 26 unopened crates and the lead-lined box that nobody had yet touched, and she breathed in the smell of old stone and cold water and would smoke and thought about the word that Gerald Frisch had used. Relieved. She hoped he was right. She put the letter aside and opened the inventory notebook again and turned to the last pages, the ones she hadn't reached yet, the entries numbered in the 40s and 50s and 60s. She found them in the same careful hand, the same format, the same density of information. And on the final page, the last entry, number 62, there was something different from all the others. The handwriting changed. The first 61 entries were all in the same hand, David Eisenberg's precise and trained script. But entry 62 was written differently. The same language, the same format, number and title and medium and dimensions. But the hand was looser, written perhaps in haste or distress, and below the entry, where no other entry had anything additional, there was a single line in German that someone had added later. She did not read German well. She took a photograph of the page on her phone and sent it to Helena. Helena replied within 20 minutes, even though it was past 10 o'clock. The line said, "For whoever finds this. He was a good man and a good brother. Please remember him. Clara." Helena had written below the translation. She added this. She must have had access to the notebook at some point before it was sealed. Margaret read that line several times. She read it until the words were not words, but something else. The trace of a woman who had survived what her brother had not, who had lived until 1989 in Brighton and raised 2 children and carried this knowledge, this particular weight of a loss that had no grave, and who had found a way, at some point, to add her own voice to the document her brother had left. Please remember him. She closed the notebook and held it for a moment with both hands. Then she looked at the hatch in the floor that led down to the Undercroft, where 26 crates waited in the dark, and the lead-lined box sat sealed at the back of the chamber, holding whatever it was holding, patient and cold and absolute. Tomorrow Isabel was coming back with her colleague from the university. Tomorrow more crates would be opened and more of the inventory would be matched to physical objects and more of the picture would become clear. The picture that David Eisenberg had carried across Europe in the autumn of 1938, that her grandfather had sealed underground in 1944, that her father had kept in the dark for 50 years out of something that was not cruelty, but was not courage either, and that she had cracked open with a cold chisel on a November morning, because she was 73 years old with 43 pounds in her current account, and nothing left to lose that mattered more than getting this right. She put the notebook down. She went to bed. She lay in the dark of the mill's small bedroom listening to the river and thought about entry 62 and the handwriting that changed and a woman in Brighton who had written one line in a sealed notebook and trusted the sealed chamber to carry it forward, and who had died not knowing whether it ever arrived. It arrived, she thought. Clara. It arrived. Anna Levi called on a Thursday morning for days. After Margaret posted the letter. She called from a Bristol number at 9:15, before Margaret had finished her first cup of tea, and her voice was quiet in a way that had a quality Margaret recognized from her years in primary schools, the quality of someone who had recently been crying and had stopped and was now trying to be steady. She said, "I received your letter yesterday. I've read it perhaps 15 times. Margaret said, "I'm glad it reached you." There was a pause. Then Anna said, "I need to ask you something directly, because I've been sitting with this letter for a day and a half, and I can't tell if it's real. I don't mean that as an accusation. I mean I don't know how to process information like this. My mother never spoke about David Eisenberg. My grandmother Clara spoke about him only once, when I was about 12, and she cried so badly that I never asked again. So I grew up with a hole in the family history where a man should have been. And now you're telling me that man left something behind. And it's been here. In England. All this time. Margaret said, "It's real. I have a solicitor who can send you official documentation if that would help. I have a conservator's preliminary report. I have photographs of the notebook. But if you want the simplest confirmation I can give you, I'll say, come and see for yourself. Come any day that suits you. The mill is where I'm living. I'll be here." Another pause. Anna said, "My Aunt Rachel wants to come too. She's 79. She lives in London." "Of course," Margaret said. They came the following Saturday. Margaret had cleaned the mill carefully, which took a full day given its state, and had bought proper food from the shop in Dunmore rather than relying on her usual sparse arrangements. She had told Barry she was expecting guests, and he had quietly appeared that Friday afternoon and swept the external path and rehung the gate that had been leaning at an angle since she arrived. She hadn't asked him to. He did it without being asked, in the way he'd been doing things at this property for 30 years, and she thanked him, and he nodded once and left. The car arrived at 11. A sensible Volvo, Anna driving, and in the passenger seat a small woman in her late 70s with white hair and the particular precision of bearing that sometimes came with very old grief, when grief had been carried so long it became posture. Margaret met them at the gate. Anna Levi was 61, as Gerald Frisch had said, but she moved with the kind of physical ease that came from years of purposeful work, the architect's habit of inhabiting spaces actively rather than just passing through them. She was dark-haired, going gray, with her gray tunkle's precise quality in her eyes, which Margaret recognized from the inventory notebook without being able to articulate why. She shook Margaret's hand with a grip that held on a moment longer than a greeting. Rachel Levi got out of the car, more slowly, and stood for a moment looking at the mill building. Her face was not easy to read. She was small, and had probably been smaller with age, and she wore a coat that had been chosen for warmth and comfort rather than appearance, which told Margaret something about her. Rachel looked at the mill for perhaps 20 seconds. The autumn light came flat and pale across the mill pond and caught the surface of the water where it moved near the wheel's edge. The old stones of the mill wall held their long warmth the way old stones did even in October. Rachel looked at the building the way people sometimes looked at things they had been told to expect, but had not quite let themselves believe until the moment of seeing. Her expression settled into something Margaret recognized, but could not easily name. The feeling of a thing that has been waited for long enough that the waiting has become part of who you are, and when the thing arrives you have to find out who you are without the waiting. Then she looked at Margaret. She said, "Clara told me about this place. Once. She said David had taken his things somewhere safe, somewhere in England, and that she hoped they were still there." She said it as if she didn't quite believe it, as if hoping was the most she could allow herself. Margaret said, "They're here. All of them, as far as we can tell." Rachel looked at her for another moment. Then she said something very quiet, almost to herself, in German, which Margaret did not understand. But she understood the quality of it. She brought them inside. Helena Voss had come down from London the evening before at Margaret's request, because Margaret understood that the first meeting with the family needed to be handled carefully, and that having a solicitor present who knew the legal landscape was better than having good intentions and no framework. Helena was in the living room when they arrived, and she stood and greeted them without fuss and explained her role briefly, and then stepped back and let the room belong to the three women. Margaret made tea. They sat at the small table, and Margaret told them everything she knew, in order, from the beginning. The letter, the will, Philip and the solicitor's office, and the drive out to the condemned mill. Barry's information about Philip's earlier visits. Peter Garland and the Undercroft. The sealed wall, and what was behind it. Anna listened without interrupting, her hands around her tea mug, occasionally looking at Helena to check a legal point or looking out the window at the mill pond. Rachel sat very still and listened with the completeness of someone who was not just hearing words but placing them, fitting them into a space that had been open for 79 years. When Margaret finished, Rachel said, "My mother never forgave herself for leaving him behind. Her mother was Clara. She said, David told her to go first. He had more inventory to arrange, more clients to settle accounts with. He said he would follow in a few months. He didn't. And then the months became something else, and she couldn't get back in. And then there was the war, and then there were the lists. She was quiet for a moment. She said, she looked for the collection for a long time after the war. She wrote to people. She tried to trace what David had done with the inventory. Nobody knew. She eventually stopped trying because every inquiry that went nowhere was another wound. She died in 1989, still not knowing if any of it had survived. Margaret said, "Your uncle kept a notebook. He wrote the inventory in it himself, every entry. And at the back, on the last page, someone added a line. Your mother's handwriting. She must have had access to the notebook before the chamber was sealed." Rachel looked at her. Margaret went and got the notebook from the desk where she kept it, inside its protective cloth wrapping, and she brought it back and opened it to the last page and turned it toward Rachel. Rachel looked at it for a long time. Her hands were in her lap. Then she put one finger on the line in German, her mother's handwriting, the line Margaret now knew by heart. She pressed the fingertip against the paper gently, as if touching the page were a way of touching the hand that had written it. She said nothing for perhaps a full minute. Then she said, quietly, she knew. She must have known about this place. She must have been here and added this and never told me. She looked up at Margaret. Her eyes were dry, but only just. She said, "Please remember him." "Yes," Margaret said. After the tea, when the conversation had found a quieter register, Margaret took them down to the Undercroft. Helena stayed at the top of the steps. She had seen the chamber already and understood this descent belonged to the family. Anna went first, with her architect's instinct for reading spaces, and she moved around the perimeter of the antechamber, looking at the walls, looking at the stonework, before turning to the sealed end. Margaret had kept the gap where the wall had been open, the stacked blocks visible to one side, the chamber itself accessible. Rachel came down the steps slowly, one hand on the iron rail, and stood at the bottom and looked at the entrance to the chamber. The torchlight fell across the nearest crates, across the oilskin parcels, across the dark shapes of things preserved. Rachel said nothing. She stood looking at it for a long time, and Anna came and stood beside her, and the two of them were still together in the cold Undercroft while the river moved outside, and the mill held its long-kept breath. Then Rachel said, "He was very organized. David. Everything in its place. He would have packed this very carefully. He would have checked everything 3 times. She looked at the nearest crate. She did not touch it. He would have believed he was coming back," she said. Margaret stood at the foot of the stairs and said nothing, because nothing was the right thing. After a while, Anna turned and looked at her. She said, "What happens now?" Helena had explained the legal process the evening before in detail, and Margaret related as clearly as she could. The full appraisal of the collection, which would take several months. The provenance research for each item, to establish the ownership chain and confirm that each work had been legitimately held by David Eisenberg before 1938. The formal restitution process, which Helena was experienced in managing. At the end of that process, the collection would be returned to the Eisenberg heirs. There would be questions about what the family wished to do with the works. Keep some, donate some, sell some. Those decisions belonged entirely to them. Anna listened carefully. Then she said, "And you? What happens to you?" Margaret said, "I got a mill. I live here." Anna looked at her steadily. "That's not what I mean." Helena had spoken to Margaret about this on the Friday evening, carefully and honestly. The finder's rights question was not straightforward because the collection had not been lost in a legally recognized sense. It had been held in informal trust. But there were precedents for acknowledging the role of the person who had identified and secured a restitution case. And there was a separate question, which Helena had raised, about whether the Eisenberg heirs might wish to make a voluntary settlement to acknowledge 80 years of safekeeping by the Hollis family. She told Anna this, keeping Helena's language. Anna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 80 years. Your grandfather built that wall. Your father maintained this property when he could have decommissioned it. And you cracked the wall open and traced the family and brought in the right people and did everything correctly when you had absolutely no legal obligation to do any of it. She paused. You could have sold the mill without ever knowing what was underneath it. I could have, Margaret said. But you stayed. I stayed. Anna looked at the chamber. Then she looked at Margaret, and something in her expression shifted, a decision being made in real time. She said, "The family will want to discuss this together. Rachel and I and Rachel's daughter and Daniel's other children. But I want you to know that I am going to recommend to the family that we recognize what your family did. Not just what you did. What your grandfather and your father did before you, even imperfectly. 80 years of safekeeping is not nothing. Margaret said, I didn't do it for that. I know, Anna said. That's rather the point. The full appraisal took 4 months. Isabel Fry returned with 2 colleagues from the university, a specialist in Dutch, Golden Age painting, and a second conservator who worked primarily with works on paper. They spent 3 weeks working through the chamber systematically, opening each crate in inventory order, examining, documenting, photographing, and securing each piece before moving to the next. Helena was present for the first week. Peter Garland came down twice and spent time with the specialists, contributing his knowledge of the mill's history and construction. The process was slow and deliberate, and Margaret found she did not mind that. She had expected impatience in herself, the desire to see everything at once, to understand the full scope in a single day. It didn't come. Each crate opened in its own time was its own thing, its own small revelation. Each work coming out of the dark after 80 years and being placed in proper light for the first time since David Eisenberg had packed it away, and the accumulation of those moments mattered more than the summary. 41 of the 62 items were paintings. Of the remainder, 8 were works on paper, drawings and watercolors wrapped in separate oilskin layers that had protected them entirely from moisture damage. 6 were small sculptures or decorative objects, including a bronze figure of uncertain attribution that the specialists spent considerable time with and eventually concluded required additional expert assessment. 4 were manuscripts, bound works in German and Latin that the university's rare books department agreed to examine. The paintings ranged in condition from very good to exceptional. The dry chamber and the stable temperature had done what David Eisenberg had hoped they would do. Only one painting showed significant damage, a small landscape on canvas where the support had developed a stress crack, probably during the move to Herefordshire in the 30s, that had remained stable since. The rest were in the condition they had been in when packed, which in several cases was the condition of paintings that had been properly maintained in a professional dealer's inventory. Clean, stable, the varnish aged but the paint beneath it intact. Margaret watched a great deal of it, when they would let her, and absented herself when they needed to concentrate without an audience. She kept painting in the mornings, the wheel and the pond and the reeds. She was working in oils now, which she hadn't done in years, and the slow, deliberate time of oil painting suited the tempo of the weeks, the sense that everything was moving at the pace things needed to move rather than the pace anyone might prefer. Philip's legal challenge was formally withdrawn in the 2nd month. Helena had submitted a 30-page document to his solicitors outlining the Eisenberg provenance, the German law governing Holocaust-era art, the international conventions on cultural property restitution, and the straightforward fact that the collection had never belonged to the Hollis family in any legally meaningful sense and therefore could not be part of any Hollis estate challenge. Philip's solicitors took 3 weeks to respond and then sent a single paragraph confirming the withdrawal without comment or apology. Philip called her once, 2 days after the withdrawal letter arrived. She did not pick up. He left a voicemail that was brief and controlled, and which said he hoped she understood he had been acting in what he believed were the family's best interests, and that he trusted there were no hard feelings. She listened to it twice. Then she deleted it. She had spent the better part of 65 years trying to occupy the correct amount of space in the Hollis family, which was to say the correct small amount, the amount that required no special accommodation or acknowledgement. She had been the middle child who did not study law or marry well, and who had made her peace with that positioning so thoroughly that she had sometimes confused the peace with satisfaction. She understood now that the two things were not the same. Peace was the absence of conflict. Satisfaction was the presence of meaning. She had had the first for a long time and had only recently acquired the second. Philip had tried to take this from her. He had tried before she even knew what it was. He had walked around this building measuring things in the belief that what was under it belonged to him by virtue of being the person the family considered most important, which was the same error in the same currency that had governed the Hollis family's understanding of her for decades. The mill had come to her not because she was the most important, but because she was the one who would not sell it. Her father had understood that, and in the end that distinction had made all the difference between what was found and what would have been lost. She did not feel triumphant. She felt, more than anything, tired in a clean way, the tiredness of work completed rather than work abandoned, the feeling after a long painting session when the light had gone and the canvas was done, and there was nothing left to do but put down the brush. Ruth came for a long weekend in January, and they opened a bottle of wine and sat by the stove and talked late into the night, the way they had when they were young teachers with small salaries and strong opinions. Ruth said, "You look different." "How?" "Less like someone carrying something they don't want. More like someone who put the weight down and found out their own legs still work." Margaret thought about that. She said, "I painted 11 canvases since I came here. More than I've done in the last 8 years combined." Ruth raised her glass. "To a condemned mill." Margaret raised hers. "To a condemned mill." The Dutch portrait went before a panel of 5 specialists in Amsterdam in February, together with technical analysis reports from Isabel's university colleagues that included X-ray imaging, pigment analysis, and dendrochronological dating of the panel's wood. The panel of 5 deliberated for 2 weeks before submitting a joint opinion that was forwarded to Helena and from Helena to Margaret. She read it on a Tuesday morning, standing at the kitchen counter with her coat still on from the walk back from the post box at the end of the lane. The opinion confirmed the attribution. It stated that on the balance of available technical and art historical evidence, the portrait was consistent with the known body of work and was most likely an autograph production by the hand named in the attribution. It noted that the condition of the work was exceptional and that its previous disappearance from the historical record had been a matter of ongoing concern to the field. She put the paper down and looked out the window at the mill pond. The wheel was moving. Barry had cleared the mill race properly the previous week, opening the sluice enough to let the river in at a controlled rate, not enough for grinding, but enough for turning. The old wheel had creaked and protested for the first hour, and then found its rhythm, the paddles dipping and lifting in the cold air, water streaming from the wood in bright threads. She had stood outside and watched it for a long time when it first moved. It was not a useful motion, not yet, not doing anything, just the wheel turning for its own sake in the winter air. But the motion of it was the thing, the simple fact of movement where there had been stillness for 50 years. She looked at it now through the window and thought about the attribution report in her hand. Helena called an hour later. "Did you read it?" "Yes." "The auction estimate for a work of that attribution and condition in the current market," Helena said carefully, "is between 8 and 14 million pounds. Margaret sat down. "That's one work," Helena continued. "One of 62. I need to be clear that the full appraisal isn't complete and that values fluctuate and that many items in a collection of this kind don't come close to the headline figures. But the range we're looking at for the full collection, based on what Isabel and her colleagues have assessed so far, is not what I described to you in November as very significant." "What would you describe it as now?" A pause. Helena said, "The working estimate for the collection in its entirety, once fully appraised, is between 35 and 55 million pounds. The stove ticked in the silence. Margaret said, "David Eisenberg carried 35 to 55 million pounds across wartime Europe in wooden crates." Helena said, "He was a very good dealer with very good taste and 30 years of acquisition." And yes, essentially, the lead line box was opened in March. The family was present, Anna and Rachel's daughter, a woman named Judith who was Margaret's age and had her grandmother Clara's quality of contained emotion. Helena was there. Isabel was there. Peter Garland drove down from Bristol for the occasion. They opened it in the Undercroft, which was properly lit now with portable daylight lamps Isabel had installed during the appraisal weeks. The chamber that had been dark and cold and sealed for 80 years was now familiar, almost domestic, its contents known and catalogued and awaiting decisions. The lead line box sat at the back as it always had, smaller than everything around it, the 4 bolt heads dark with age. Isabel used a penetrating oil on the bolts and waited 20 minutes. Then she worked them loose one at a time, carefully, and lifted the lid. Inside, packed in dry cloth, were 3 categories of things. The first was a velvet pouch, tied at the neck, which contained jewelry. Not decorative pieces, not collector's items, but personal jewelry. A woman's ring, plain gold, worn smooth. A small brooch of the kind made in the early part of the century. A pair of earrings set with garnets. A man's watch, gold, with an inscription on the back in German that Judith read aloud in a voice that was very careful. "To David, with love, on his 21st birthday, from your mother and father." The room was quiet. The second item was a small bundle of photographs, unmounted, the edges slightly curved from the decades in the box. They had been wrapped in cloth, and the cloth had protected them. The images were brown and white and slightly faded, but clear. Family photographs, a kind Margaret recognized even across the gap of 80 years. People standing together with the slightly formal stiffness that photographs demanded in that period, and underneath the formality, the particular ease of people who were comfortable with each other. A man and a woman outside what must have been the Vienna Gallery, the Dorotheergasse address just visible on the door frame. A young Clara, unmistakably Clara given her resemblance to Rachel, laughing at something outside the frame. A family portrait, perhaps 10 people, parents and children and grandparents, the kind taken at a significant occasion, which would have been ordinary then and was irreplaceable now. Rachel took those photographs from Isabel's hands and held them and looked at each one for a long time. The third thing was a sealed letter, not addressed to anyone on the outside, just a folded paper, sealed with the same plain wax as the letter in the tin box, and inside, when Helena carefully broke the seal and unfolded it, 3 pages in David Eisenberg's hand, in German. Judith translated it quietly for the room. He had written it to Clara. He had written it as if he expected to die, because presumably in 1944 he had understood what was likely. He said he had left the collection in the care of a good man. He gave Thomas Hollis's name and the address of the mill. He described the notebook and its location in the tin box. He said the inventory was complete and accurate, and that Clara would know what to do. He wrote about each item in the jewelry pouch. The ring had been their mother's. The brooch had been a gift to their mother from their father on their wedding day. He had taken them when he left Vienna because he could not leave them to be taken by others. He wanted Clara to have them. He wrote about the photographs. He said he was sorry he had only kept the ones he had. He hoped they were enough. He wrote at the end, "I don't know if you'll find this. I don't know if you'll find any of it. But I want you to know that every decision I made believing the world would come right again. I still believe that. I don't know when. But the wheel doesn't stop turning just because the water's been blocked. It waits." Judith's voice had thinned to almost nothing by the last sentence. She stopped. The room held the words. Rachel was holding the photographs of Clara against her chest. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Anna said, very quietly, "He wrote it to her, and she read it. She must have come here at some point and opened the box and read the letter and added her line to the notebook and sealed it all back up. And kept it secret for the rest of her life," Judith said. Rachel looked up. She kept it secret because she was afraid. She always said she was afraid that if she asked too much, the remaining pieces of him would disappear. She had his letter. She had the knowledge of where it all was. She sealed it back up because having it sealed meant it was still safe. It meant he was still, in some way, protected. Margaret looked at the wheel inscription from David's mother and father and thought about all the forms that love took when the ordinary expressions were impossible. The letter to a sister who might never read it. The ring packed in velvet in a lead-lined box. The line added in a notebook in a sealed room. The mill maintained for 50 years by a man who was afraid but did not stop. She thought about the specific courage of ordinary people doing the only thing available to them. Her grandfather had not been a remarkable man in any historical sense. He had been a farmer in Herefordshire who kept his word when the person he had given it to did not come back, and who taught his son to keep it after him. David Eisenberg had not been able to save himself, but he had been able to save the things he had spent his life accumulating by the act of trusting one honest man. Clara had not been able to save her brother, but she had been able to find this room, to open the box, to read his letter, and to leave one sentence behind. Rachel had not known any of this was here, but she had kept her mother's memory and driven to Herefordshire at 79 and stood in an Undercroft in the cold October air and been willing to receive what had been kept for her. And Margaret had been given a condemned mill by a father who could not find the courage to do what he knew was right until he had nothing left to lose. And she had stayed because some part of her had understood there was something here that the obvious story did not contain. All of them together, across 80 years and 3 generations and an entire war, had made this moment possible. The wheel doesn't stop turning just because the water's been blocked. It waits. She thought about her grandfather building the wall. She thought about her father sitting in this property every decade or so to check on it, walking the perimeter, making sure the building stood. She had assumed, all these years, that the mill was simply an unloved piece of land that nobody wanted to develop. She understood now that her father had maintained it against exactly the possibility of this day, not with courage, as he had admitted, but with the stubbornness of a man who could not bring himself to do the wrong thing even if he couldn't quite manage the right one. The formal announcement of the collection's discovery was made in April, managed by Helena in consultation with the family and with the relevant cultural institutions. It went to the press on a Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon Margaret's phone was ringing with numbers she didn't recognize, which she didn't answer, and messages from journalists she had no intention of speaking to. The story ran in several national newspapers. It ran in Austrian and Dutch and German publications. The attribution of the Dutch portrait was its own separate story in the art press, which Helena had anticipated and had managed by ensuring the panel's formal opinion was the version on record rather than speculation. The photographs accompanying the press release were the ones Diana had taken during the opening of the wall, the chamber visible in the background, the crates stacked against the sandstone walls, the oilskin parcels laid flat on the stone floor. The discovery of the watch inscription, David Eisenberg's name and the date, was in every version of the story. The headline in the national broadsheet ran across 2 columns. It said, "Condemned Watermill concealed £40 million art collection for 80 years." The subheading said, 73-year-old inherits worthless property, discovers wartime cache of old masters. Margaret read both lines and put the paper down and made more tea. The local paper from Dunmore ran the story on the front page and included a photograph of the mill that someone must have taken from the public footpath, the wheel visible and turning, which at least meant it was a better image than the old assessor's report would have provided. The village reacted in the complicated way villages reacted to such things. Some people were openly proud, others were quietly embarrassed that they had assumed she would sell and leave. The woman from the coffee shop on the high street, who had not spoken to her previously, stopped her on the pavement the week the story ran and said it was an amazing thing she'd done, holding on like that. Marge from the cafe called it grit, which Margaret thought was probably the most accurate word anyone used. Helena had kept Philip's name out of the press release entirely, which she had done strategically and which she described to Margaret as giving him the option of remaining anonymous in perpetuity provided he stayed out of the way, which she suspected he would choose to do. He did. Caroline called, which was unexpected. She called on the Thursday after the press release, and her voice was different from the solicitor's office voice. Not warm exactly, but honest. She said, "I had no idea, Margaret. I want you to know that. Philip didn't tell me what he thought was down there. I thought you'd been given a wreck." Margaret said she believed her. Caroline said, "I'm sorry for the dismissiveness. It was reflexive and it was wrong, and I'm sorry." This was more than Margaret had expected from her, and she received it accordingly. The family had their conversations about the collection over several months. Anna drove to the mill 3 more times in the spring, sometimes alone, once with Rachel, once with Judith and Rachel's 2 grandchildren, who were in their 20s and who stood in the chamber with the straightforward wonder of young people confronting history made physical. The youngest of them, a young man named Michael who was 24 and studying film, stood looking at the stacked crates for a long time and then turned to Margaret and said, "My great-great-uncle packed these. He wrapped all of this with his own hands." "Yes," Margaret said. He looked around the chamber. The stonework, the dry still air, he said, and then he died not knowing if anyone would ever open them. "Yes," she said. Michael was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "But someone did." The decisions about the collection were made by the family collectively and were communicated to Helena in June. 8 works would be donated to institutions, the Dutch portrait to a Dutch national museum, subject to negotiation. 3 of the 16th-century Flemish panels to an Austrian institution that had been attempting to trace Eisenberg provenance works for 20 years, 2 works on paper to a Vienna collection, the remaining 2 to a London museum with a strong provenance research program. The donation decisions were made partly on the basis of where the works had histories of exhibition and partly on the basis of where the family felt David Eisenberg would have wanted them to be seen. The remaining 54 works would be sold at auction, in 2 tranches, in London and Amsterdam. The proceeds would be distributed among the family according to a structure they had agreed privately. The first auction took place in London in November, 13 months after Margaret had signed the papers transferring Cresswell Mill to her name in a solicitor's office that smelled of wood polish and the memory of other people's difficult news. She attended at Helena's invitation, sitting at the back of the room with Ruth beside her, watching the room fill with people who wore their understanding of value in the way they moved and held their catalogs and spoke to each other in the particular half-sentences of people who shared a specialist language. The Dutch portrait went under the hammer in the second tranche in Amsterdam the following spring and realized £11.2 million. Margaret read the figure in the report Helena sent her and thought about an oilskin parcel on a stone floor in a chamber sealed since 1944 and about a man who had wrapped it himself, carefully, checking the folds 3 times the way Rachel had said he would. The journalism at the time of the auctions returned to the story with the additional detail of the final realized values. The total across both sales came to £41 million. The headline in the broadsheet the morning after the second auction said, "Hidden Mill Collection realized £41 million. The subheadline said, "Family of Vienna dealer who entrusted works to English farmer receives proceeds 80 years later." She cut that page out and put it in the drawer of the desk where she kept David Eisenberg's inventory notebook. She did not pin it anywhere or show it to anyone. She just kept it because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be kept. Before any of that, though, before the auction and the donations and the institutional negotiations, the family gave Margaret a letter. A formal letter, on headed paper, signed by Anna and Rachel's daughter and Daniel Levi's children, all of whom had been named in the legal process as Eisenberg heirs. Helena brought it in person in late May, which Margaret had not expected. She drove down from London on a Friday afternoon with the letter in an envelope and handed it over with the quiet of someone who had been waiting to hand over this particular document and was glad the wait was over. The letter expressed the family's formal gratitude for the role of the Hollis family in safeguarding the collection. It acknowledged Thomas Hollis and Edmund Hollis by name. It stated that the family wished to recognize Margaret's role in discovering and correctly managing the collection, and to acknowledge the 80 years of custodianship that had kept it intact. Then it stated the sum they were offering as a voluntary settlement. Margaret read the number and set the letter down on the table and looked at the mill pond for a long time. The wheel was turning. Outside the window it turned steadily, the paddles dipping and rising, the water falling from them in the morning light. She had never grown accustomed to it. Every time she looked at it, she felt something she couldn't quite name, something that sat between gratitude and astonishment, the same feeling she sometimes got at the end of a painting she had worked hard on, when it resolved and became itself, and she understood that the work had been worth doing. She picked up the letter and read the number again. Helena said, "You're not obliged to accept." But the family discussed it at length, and they're unanimous. It reflects what they believe is fair for the safekeeping and the work of discovery and tracing. You can accept it or propose a different figure if you think it's wrong in either direction. "It's not wrong," Margaret said. She folded the letter carefully and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she said, "Tell them thank you. Tell them I'll spend it well." Helena smiled, which was not a common occurrence in their professional dealings. She said, "I believe you will." The sum was enough to restore the mill completely, not to make it grand. The mill was not grand. It was a 17th-century working structure that had no pretensions and would have looked strange acquiring them now. But to make it sound and livable and permanent, to replace what had rotted and reinforce what had weakened and return the millrace and the wheel to full working capacity, to put proper plumbing in and a real kitchen and a heating system that didn't require 3 layers of clothing by November. It was also enough to live without worry for however many years remained. Not extravagantly, not in a manner she had never needed and didn't want now. Simply without worry, which at 73 was the kind of wealth that mattered most. She called Ruth that evening. Ruth said, "Tell me the number." She told her. Ruth said, "Margaret Rose Hollis. I know. You came here with £43. I know. The repair of the mill took the summer. Barry managed it with his characteristic efficiency, bringing in the right people for the right work, arriving himself at 7 each morning and leaving each evening with a brief account of what had been done and what remained. The roof was replaced properly. The stone walls were repointed. New windows, double-glazed this time, went in on every elevation. The mill race was cleared and lined, and the sluice mechanism, which had been seized since the 70s, was dismantled, repaired, and reinstalled. The wheel was the last project, and Barry had been looking forward to it. Margaret could tell, since the beginning. He brought in a specialist from Wales who had spent his career restoring historic mill mechanisms, a careful moving man of about 60 who spoke very little and touched every surface of the wheel assembly with the deliberateness of a doctor examining a patient. He replaced the rotten paddles, recut the worn faces on the axle housing, rebalanced the wheel on its shaft, and checked every component of the gearing and millstone system. On the last day of September, Barry opened the sluice fully for the first time in 50 years. The water came in along the cleaned and lined millrace with a sound that began as a murmur and became a rush. It hit the wheel paddles, and the wheel turned, slowly at first, with the complaint of old mechanisms rediscovering themselves, and then steadily, and then with the assurance of something that had been built for this purpose and was now, after a long absence, fulfilling it. The gearing turned. The millstones moved in their housings with a low grumbling sound like distant thunder. The whole building found a vibration it had been missing for decades, a deep, rhythmic pulse that came up through the floors and the walls and was present in the air the way heartbeat was present in a chest. Margaret stood outside and listened to it. The sound of the mill working was unlike anything she had heard it do before, not as a broken thing in her childhood and not as a silent ruin in October. This was the sound of purpose, the sound of a mechanism that had been built to do a specific job over centuries and was doing it again. Water transformed into motion transformed into useful work, the ancient equation of a mill stated plainly in stone and oak and turning iron. Peter Garland had come down for the occasion, and Anna was there, and Helena, and Ruth, who had driven from Hereford that morning and stood with her hands in her pockets looking entirely pleased with herself on someone else's behalf. Barry stood by the sluice mechanism with his arms folded and said nothing, which was his version of satisfaction. Rachel was there too, which Margaret had not expected. Anna had brought her, and she stood at the edge of the mill pond with her coat pulled close against the September cool, watching the wheel turn. She watched it for a long time without speaking. Then she said to Margaret, quietly enough that only Margaret heard, "He wrote about this. In the letter inside the box. He said the wheel would turn again." Margaret looked at the wheel and said yes. Rachel said, "He believed that. Even then, he believed that the good things would come back around if they were kept safe long enough." The wheel turned. The water fell from it in streams that caught the late September sun and broke into light. The mill pond, which had been choked with reeds in October when Margaret first walked around it, and which had been gradually cleared over the summer, lay open and bright, and moving at its surface where the outflow from the wheel stirred it. Anna came and stood beside Margaret. She said, "David would have liked this." Margaret thought about a man she had never met, who had sat in a Vienna gallery on the Dorotheergasse and acquired works of quiet, extraordinary beauty and catalogued them with the meticulous care of someone who believed that things of beauty deserved to be remembered precisely, who had packed those things into wooden crates and wrapped them in oilskin and driven them to a watermill in Herefordshire and trusted a farmer he barely knew and left and did not come back. She thought about the wheel. The wheel doesn't stop turning just because the water's been blocked. It waits. She said, "I think he would have." The autumn came on slowly, the light doing what it always did over the mill pond, the hammered silver that she had spent 40 years trying to reproduce in paint and could still not quite get right, though she was closer now than she had ever been. The mill around her was warm and solid and itself, not restored to something it had never been but returned to what it was, what it had always been, a place that did useful work and kept its walls and outlasted the people who questioned its value. Philip had been wrong about the mill. Mr. Ashford had been circumspect. Caroline had been dismissive. The two assessors who had condemned the building had looked at the roof and the wheel and the blocked mill race and seen what was wrong, and they had not been wrong to see those things. What they had not seen was what was underneath. What was underneath was 62 items in a sandstone chamber, packed with love and urgency and the belief that the world would come right again. What was underneath was a letter from a man who expected to die and wrote to his sister anyway. What was underneath was a line in a notebook in a woman's handwriting. Please remember him. What was underneath was the reason the mill had been maintained when it should have been decommissioned. The reason her father had left it to her instead of Philip. The reason a 73-year-old woman with 43 pounds in her current account and a one-bedroom flat in Hereford had stayed when she should have sold. She thought about the moment she had stood inside the dark building for the first time with the padlock in her hand, smelling the damp stone and the old iron and the quality of air that had not moved in years. She had not known then what she was staying for. She had only known that Philip's calm in the solicitor's office was the wrong kind of calm, and that the mill had felt, in that first touch of its wall, like something that did not want to be walked away from. She had stayed because the building asked her to. That was not a rational explanation, but it was the true one, and she had learned that the true explanations and the rational ones were not always the same thing, and that when they differed it was worth paying attention to which was which. She had stayed and found David Eisenberg's name in a tin box. She had stayed and found Clara's handwriting at the bottom of the last page. She had stayed and sat in a cold Undercroft with Rachel Levi while an old woman pressed one finger to her dead mother's words and held it there without speaking. And whatever was in that silence was not something that any calculation about roof repairs and millrace clearance costs had ever been going to reach. The wheel turned outside. It had been turning for 3 weeks, and she was still not accustomed to it. She hoped she never would be. Some things were worth staying astonished by. The motion of a wheel that had been still for 50 years and had now found its rhythm was one of them. Some things wait under the surface of the obvious for a very long time. They wait for the person who will look past the broken wheel and the rotten roof and the blocked mill race and ask the question that matters, which is not what is wrong with this place, but what does this place hold? She had asked that question. She had stayed long enough to learn the answer. She put a new canvas on the board that evening and mixed the colors for the mill pond light and began. The London auction house on King Street was the kind of building that had absorbed so many significant transactions over so many decades that it no longer felt the weight of any individual one. The carpet was dark red. The chandeliers were polished. The room filled on the morning of the first sale with the particular mix of people that attended such events. Dealers who moved with the efficiency of professionals working, private collectors who moved with the self-consciousness of people spending large sums in public, journalists who moved with the sideways alertness of people looking for a story in the room as much as on the walls. Margaret sat in the third row with Ruth on one side and Helena on the other. She had worn the blue coat she'd bought 30 years ago for Gerald's work dinners, which still fit and still looked right for rooms that required a certain degree of seriousness. Ruth had said it was elegant. Helena had not commented on clothing because Helena did not comment on clothing. The first 14 lots passed with the brisk efficiency of the auctioneer's practiced rhythm. Bidding paddles rose and fell. Numbers climbed. The room made its collective sound of attention and release. Then lot 15 was brought in. It was one of the Flemish panels from the first crate Isabel had opened. Not the most valuable piece in the sale, the auction house had sequenced carefully, building toward the headline lots. But it was the first piece from David Eisenberg's collection to sell, and Margaret knew it. And the knowledge sat differently from anything she had felt in the preceding months of paperwork and assessment and legal process. The auctioneer described the panel in the practiced language of the catalog. Flemish school, 16th century, devotional subject, oil on panel, exceptional condition, provenance as described. The provenance as described was the Eisenberg collection, Cresswell Mill, Herefordshire. Those words were in every lot description in the sale. Helena had insured it. The story was part of the record now, the full chain of custody from a Vienna gallery to a Herefordshire Watermill to this red-carpeted room, and it would remain part of the record permanently, attached to each work wherever it went. The bidding opened. Paddles came up. The number climbed in increments Margaret could not entirely follow, not because they were unclear, but because the scale of them was still, after everything, difficult to process. The panel sold to a telephone bidder for £240,000. She did not react visibly. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the panel leave the room and thought about Isabel Fry crouching on the stone floor of the Undercroft with her raking light, the colors appearing at the edge of the dark varnish. Warm reds. A particular blue. Ruth leaned slightly toward her. All right. She said yes. At the end of the sale, when the room had thinned and the staff were moving between the lots that hadn't sold and the ones awaiting collection, Helena touched her arm and said, 9 of the 14 lots sold. Total realized, for $0.3 million. That was one afternoon. She drove back to the mill that evening and stood outside in the dark listening to the wheel. Michael came to Cresswell Mill in February, which was the coldest month and the one Margaret had privately decided she liked best at the mill, because the mill pond froze at its edges and the bare willows along the river bank showed their structure without leaves, and the light, when it came, was low and direct and made everything look like it had been drawn rather than grown. He was 24, Rachel's youngest grandchild, and he was making a documentary. He had been honest about it when he called, which she had appreciated. He said he was not a professional filmmaker yet, but he had studied film at university, and he had a camera and a genuine interest in the story, and he thought it needed to be told in a form beyond journalism. She asked what form he meant. He said, the real story, not the art, not the money. The part about David and Clara, and what it means that your grandfather kept a promise to a man who died without knowing if it had been kept. She said he could come. He arrived on a Tuesday with a camera bag and a coat that was too light for a Herefordshire February, and an expression of determined concentration that reminded her of her best students at the primary school, the ones who had decided they were interested in something and were going to stay interested regardless of difficulty. She showed him the mill. He filmed the wheel, which he spent a long time on, returning to it from different angles at different times of day, looking for the right way to show motion and weight simultaneously. He filmed the Undercroft, the marks where the wall had been, the stone floor, the empty chamber that had been emptied now of everything except the battens the crates had rested on and the memory of what had been there. He filmed the notebook, which Margaret held while he worked, and the photograph of the Dorothea gas gallery that Gerald Frisch had found in an archive and sent to her. On the second day, he asked if he could interview her. She sat in the living room chair while he set the camera on a small tripod, and the February light came through the window behind her and fell on the mill pond. He asked her about the moment she had decided to stay. She thought about it properly before answering, which she had not done in the months of press inquiries, because the press inquiries had wanted the short version and she had given them the short version. She said, I think I had been invisible for a long time without knowing it. Not unhappy, I want to be clear about that. My life was good, but there's a difference between a life that's good and a life that's asking something of you. And I had not been asked anything for a long time. This place asked something of me from the first afternoon. I didn't know what it was asking yet, but I knew it was asking. He said, was it frightening? She thought about that too. I was frightened of failing. Not of the physical work, not of the cost, not of Philip and his solicitor's letters. I was frightened of finding out that my instinct was wrong, that I had stayed and there was nothing here, and I had wasted the last good years I had on a condemned building. That kind of fear is different from ordinary fear because it's about who you are, not what might happen to you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, but you stayed anyway. She looked at the mill pond through the window. The ice at the edges had not melted. The wheel was turning in the cold air, the water dark beneath it. She said, I stayed because I had 43 pounds in my current account and a subletting arrangement and nothing more urgent to do. Sometimes circumstances and instinct happen to line up. I was lucky they did. He smiled at that. He said, Rachel said something similar. She said the women in her family were always the ones who stayed when they should have left and left when they should have stayed. She said you're the first Hollis she'd be willing to call an exception. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, tell her I'll take that. The letter from Vienna arrived in March, from the director of the institution that had accepted the donation of the 3 Flemish panels. It was formal in structure, as institutional letters were required to be, but it was not cold. The director wrote that the panels had arrived safely and had been examined by the Conservation Department, whose preliminary findings confirmed Isabel Fry's assessment of their condition and broadly supported the dating suggested in the inventory. He wrote that the institution's provenance research team had been able to cross-reference 2 of the 3 panels with pre-war exhibition records that placed them in Viennese collections in the 1920s and early 1930s, which completed the documentation chain. Then he wrote a paragraph that was different in register from the rest of the letter, as if he had stopped being an institutional director for a moment and become simply a person writing to another person. He wrote, the question of what became of works that left Vienna in the years between 1933 and 1939 has occupied this institution for many decades. We have been fortunate to reacquire several significant pieces through restitution processes, but for every work successfully traced, there are many others that remain lost. To receive 3 panels in the condition these have arrived, with a provenance trail as complete as the Eisenberg inventory provides, is exceptional. It tells us not only where the works have been, but that they were cared for, that someone understood their value and took that responsibility seriously. We will exhibit these works with a full account of their history, including the names of Thomas and Edmund Hollis and of Margaret Hollis, who completed what they kept. She read that last sentence several times. She had not expected to be named. She had not done it to be named. But there was something in seeing the three names together, her grandfather's, her father's, hers, that made the weight of the thing real in a way that monetary values and auction records had not quite managed. 3 names. 3 generations. One promise kept across 80 years. She put the letter in the desk drawer where she kept the inventory notebook and David Eisenberg's inventory entry number 1 and the press clipping and her father's letter. The drawer was becoming, she noticed, a kind of archive. Not intentionally. She had not decided to keep these things together. But they had gathered. The way things gathered around a gravity they created themselves. Rachel came back to the mill in April, alone this time, without Anna or Judith or the grandchildren. She called ahead and said she wanted to come on a weekday when it was quiet, if that was all right. Margaret said of course. She arrived at 11 and they walked the property together in the spring air, which was soft and smelled of the river and the new growth along the mill pond bank, where the reeds that had been cut back the previous year were returning in bright green spears. The wheel was turning. The mill pond had been clear of ice for 6 weeks and was back to its moving surface, the light on it doing what it always did, that hammered silver quality that shifted with the angle of the sun. Rachel walked slowly and Margaret walked at her pace, and neither of them spoke much. They were past the point, Margaret had found, where silence between them required filling. They had sat together in an Undercroft while David Eisenberg's letter was read aloud. The silences after that had a different texture. At the mill pond's edge, Rachel stopped and looked at the wheel. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said to Michael. About instinct and circumstances lining up." Margaret waited. Rachel said, "David was like that. My mother always said he trusted things that couldn't be explained. He trusted my grandfather as a good man before he had any reason to. He trusted that the war would end and the world would stabilize, even when everything around him said otherwise." She paused. She used to say that trusting the unknowable was his greatest quality and his greatest weakness simultaneously. Margaret looked at the wheel. She said, "Your mother kept this all her life." "I know. She could have told you." Rachel turned to look at her. She had her mother's eyes, which Margaret had seen in the family photographs from the lead-lined box, the same level and measure quality. She said, she was afraid that speaking it would break it, that if she said there is a mill in Herefordshire where David left everything, it would somehow become untrue. She'd had so many things become untrue. She learned to keep the things that mattered inside where nothing could get at them. Margaret thought about her father, who had learned the same lesson for different reasons. The things kept inside where nothing could get at them. The mill maintained, but never opened. The secret carried as a weight rather than a gift because the gift required a courage he couldn't find until the very end. She said, "I think they both kept it the only way they could." Rachel nodded. Then she said, "I want to ask you something. You don't have to say yes." She asked whether Margaret would allow the jewelry from the lead-lined box to stay at the mill. Not permanently, not as a formal loan or arrangement, but as a presence. The ring and the brooch and the earrings and the watch. Rachel had considered keeping them in London, but she had found, since the opening of the box, that she thought about the mill when she thought about them. They had spent 80 years in a Herefordshire sandstone chamber, and London felt wrong for them somehow. They had found where they belonged, and she was reluctant to take them far from it. Margaret said she was honored. She said she would keep them properly, that Helena could advise on appropriate storage. Rachel reached into her coat pocket and produced a small velvet pouch. She held it for a moment, then passed it to Margaret. The weight of it was small and significant simultaneously. A woman's ring, a brooch, garnet earrings, a watch with an inscription, "To David, with love," on his 21st birthday. Margaret held the pouch in both hands. Rachel said, "He would have wanted them somewhere the wheel could be heard." They stood together by the mill pond for a while, the wheel turning behind them, the water moving, the spring air doing what spring air did in this valley, which was to make everything seem possible in a way that was either naive or simply true depending on how long you had been paying attention to the world. The wheel turned. Margaret thought about £43 in a current account and a letter from a solicitor in a town she had not allowed herself to think about for years. She thought about a padlock with a loose hasp and the smell of undisturbed air. She thought about 11 courses of sandstone blocks and what a man would have to believe in to lay them in the dark. The spring light moved on the mill pond, and the water caught it and turned it and let it go in bright pieces. And Margaret Hollis, 73 years old, keeper of a condemned mill and a sealed promise and 80 years of someone else's trust, held a small velvet pouch in both hands and understood that this was what it felt like when the water came back. Not a dramatic event, not a single transforming moment, just the wheel, turning again, doing what it had always been built to do, patient and present and entirely itself. She put the pouch in her coat pocket, next to the warmth of her own hand. She would hang the watch above the desk, where she kept the notebook. Every morning when she came to paint, she would see it, and she would remember that David Eisenberg had packed his mother's ring and his father's gift and his sister's photographs and 62 works of extraordinary beauty and carried them across a collapsing world because he believed there would be a world on the other side worth carrying them to. He had been right. He had not lived to see it, which was the cost. But the works were in museums now, and the family had their grandmother's photographs, and the watch was going above the desk of a Watermill in Herefordshire, and the wheel was turning. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the particular arithmetic of things that outlasted their makers, everything. Michael's documentary was completed 18 months later and shown at a small festival in Bristol, where Anna and Rachel and Ruth and Barry and Peter Garland sat together in a dark room and watched the mill appear on screen, the wheel turning in the low February light, the water falling from the paddles in bright threads. When the Undercroft appeared, the empty chamber with its worn battens and its cold, still air, the room was quiet in the way that rooms went quiet when something true was being shown rather than performed. The film's final image was the inventory notebook, open to the last page. The camera rested on Clara's handwriting for a long time before the credits came. Not the whole line, just 3 words, held in the light. Please remember him. The wheel turned outside the window of a Herefordshire mill, and in the morning Margaret came downstairs and put the kettle on and looked at the watch above the desk and began the day. She had painted 31 canvases since arriving at the mill in October of the previous year. 14 of them were the mill pond in different lights and seasons. 6 were the wheel. 3 were the Undercroft, the chamber, the quality of sealed air made visible. The others were various. The reeds, the river, Barry's truck in the lane, the heron that had returned to its position at the pond's edge now that the water was clean. Ruth had asked, on her last visit, whether she would ever show them. Margaret had looked at the canvases stacked against the living room wall and thought about the answer honestly. Then she said, "I think I might. Not soon. When the story has settled into the past enough to become something other than news." She paused. David Eisenberg spent his life acquiring works of beauty and trusting that beauty mattered. The least I can do is keep painting and trust the same thing. Ruth had said that was the right answer. The wheel turned outside. The light moved on the water. The mill held its long warmth. 300 years of stone remembering every winter it had outlasted and expecting to outlast the next. Margaret picked up her brush. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.